When my son Marcus leaned over my husband's casket at Riverside Memorial Chapel and whispered, "You're next, old woman," he had no idea that I had spent 53 years building a real estate empire worth over $400 million, and I was about to use every property deed, every business connection, and every legal maneuver at my disposal to show him that threatening a 70-year-old widow who controlled half the commercial properties in Phoenix was the most devastating mistake of his greedy, entitled existence. Before I tell you how my own son learned that attempting to intimidate someone who had quietly amassed more wealth and power than he could ever imagine would result in his complete financial destruction and social exile in less than 72 hours, tell me where you're watching from. And if this story of family betrayal and perfectly calculated justice resonates with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow, I have another incredible story of underestimated women getting their revenge that will absolutely shock you. My name is Eleanor Catherine Morrison. I'm 72 years old, and I'm about to tell you how my eldest son Marcus, a man who had been waiting decades for his father and me to die so he could inherit what he believed was a modest retirement nest egg, thought he could terrorize me into signing over my assets by making death threats at my beloved husband's funeral, only to discover that the frail old woman he saw as an easy target was actually Eleanor Morrison, founder and CEO of Desert Crown Properties, the real estate company that owned the building where he worked, the apartment. You see, when people looked at me that gray October morning at Walter's funeral, they saw exactly what Marcus saw. A petite 72-year-old woman with silver hair styled in a simple chignon, wearing a modest black dress from JCPenney that cost $48, clutching a worn leather purse that had served me faithfully for 15 years, standing beside her husband's casket with the quiet dignity that comes from 5 decades of marriage to a good man. They saw someone who might have worked as a school secretary or a church volunteer. Someone who drove a 15-year-old Toyota Camry with faded paint and accumulated over 200,000 miles. Someone who clipped coupons from the Sunday paper and shopped at discount grocery stores. Someone who represented tradition and simplicity rather than wealth and influence. Marcus had been seeing me this way for his entire 48 years of life. Watching me arrive at family gatherings in my reliable but unremarkable car, wearing clothes from Walmart and Target, carrying homemade casseroles in simple glass dishes that I had owned since the 1980s. He would observe me listening quietly during family conversations about money and investments, nodding politely when younger relatives discussed their careers and financial goals, never asserting myself as someone who might have valuable insights about business or wealth management that could have transformed their lives. In Marcus's mind, I was exactly what I appeared to be, his father's devoted wife who had never worked outside the home, someone who had lived a comfortable but unremarkable middle-class life supported entirely by Walter's modest career as a high school math teacher and coach. Someone whose understanding of finances was limited to balancing checkbooks and managing household budgets. Someone who would be lost and vulnerable after Walter's death, dependent on her children's guidance and support to navigate the complex world of finances and legal matters that would inevitably follow his passing. What Marcus didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn despite 4 decades of family dinners, holiday gatherings, and countless opportunities to ask meaningful questions about his parents' lives, was that the woman he assumed had spent her adult life baking cookies and volunteering at church fundraisers had actually built one of the most successful real estate investment companies in the Southwest, starting with a single duplex purchase in 1971, with $3,000 we had saved from Walter's teaching salary and systematically acquired. But I had learned, very early in my marriage and business career, that sometimes the most effective way to build wealth and maintain family harmony was to let people believe you were exactly what they expected to see. When business partners, tenants, contractors, city officials, and even family members thought they were dealing with Walter Morrison's quiet, traditional wife, rather than a strategic investor who could buy and sell most of them several times over, they revealed their true characters and motivations in ways that proved invaluable for both business decisions and personal relationships. So I had become extraordinarily skilled at appearing unremarkable when it served my purposes, observing how people treated those they considered powerless or unimportant, and gathering information about character and priorities that would have been impossible to obtain if they knew they were being evaluated by someone who could dramatically affect their financial futures and life circumstances. This strategy had worked perfectly for over 5 decades, allowing me to build my empire while protecting my family from the complications and corruptions that often accompany visible wealth. I could evaluate potential business partners based on how they treated my apparent modest circumstances. I could assess the character of my children's friends, romantic partners, and eventually spouses, based on their genuine behavior, rather than calculated performances designed to impress wealthy parents. Most importantly, I could observe my own children's development and character formation without the distorting effects of obvious wealth that might have created entitlement, laziness, or superficial values that would have undermined their authentic personal growth and moral development. Marcus had failed this character test so spectacularly over the years that his behavior had become a source of deep concern not just for me, but for Walter, who had gradually understood that our eldest son's treatment of service workers, elderly relatives, and anyone he considered beneath his aspirations revealed fundamental problems with his values and moral character that couldn't be corrected through gentle guidance or patient example. Instead of treating my apparent modest circumstances with love and respect, Marcus had become increasingly condescending and dismissive as he reached middle age and became frustrated with his own financial limitations. Instead of appreciating the opportunity to build a genuine relationship with his aging parents, he had begun to see us as financial obstacles, standing between him and the inheritance he believed he deserved for simply being born into our family and tolerating our continued existence. More troubling, Marcus had begun to make comments about how difficult it would be to manage our affairs when we became too old to handle things ourselves, and how much simpler everyone's life would be when Walter and I understood our limitations and transferred control of our assets to him for proper management and family protection. These seemingly caring expressions of concern were actually thinly veiled threats and manipulative attempts to pressure us into surrendering control of our finances while we were still alive and capable of making our own decisions. These comments revealed Marcus's complete misunderstanding of both family relationships and financial realities. He assumed that his parents' value was diminishing with age, and that their assets were becoming burdens rather than resources that we had every right to control and distribute according to our own values and priorities. He viewed our aging as a business opportunity rather than a natural process that deserved respect and support. But Marcus's condescending attitude toward our apparent financial limitations was just one symptom of a much larger problem with his character and his approach to relationships. Over the past decade, I had watched my eldest son transform from someone who had initially seemed loving and respectful into someone who viewed other people primarily in terms of what they could provide for his advancement, or how they might interfere with his plans for personal enrichment. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable, beginning around the time Marcus reached his 40th birthday and started to realize that his career as a middle management insurance adjuster wasn't going to provide the lifestyle and financial security he had always assumed would be his birthright as the son of property-owning parents in a desirable metropolitan area. Marcus Anthony Morrison had grown up in a comfortable middle-class household in Phoenix, where Walter and I had maintained the lifestyle of a teacher's family while I quietly built my real estate empire through careful investments and strategic property acquisitions that required enormous amounts of research, negotiation, and financial management that I conducted during evening hours and weekends, while maintaining my role as a traditional wife and mother. From Marcus's perspective, his childhood had been secure and pleasant, with family vacations to national parks, Christmas presents that were generous but not extravagant, and college tuition that suggested his parents were financially stable but not particularly wealthy. We had lived in the same modest 3-bedroom ranch house for 30 years, driven reliable but unremarkable cars, and shopped at mainstream department stores and grocery chains that served middle-class families throughout the Phoenix area. What Marcus had never understood was that our modest lifestyle was a deliberate choice, rather than a financial limitation. We could have afforded a mansion in Paradise Valley, luxury cars, private schools, and exotic international vacations, but Walter and I had agreed that raising our children with authentic values and realistic expectations was more important than displaying wealth that might corrupt their character or create unrealistic entitlement that would damage their personal development and relationships. This decision to maintain a middle-class lifestyle while building substantial wealth had worked well for our younger children, Michael and Sarah, who had developed strong work ethics, genuine concern for others, and realistic understanding of money and responsibility that had served them well in their adult lives and marriages. Both Michael and Sarah had built successful careers through their own efforts, maintained healthy relationships with their spouses and children, and demonstrated the kind of character and values that made Walter and me proud to be their parents. But Marcus had interpreted our modest living as evidence that we were people of limited means and limited sophistication, never imagining that his parents might have capabilities and resources far beyond what was immediately visible. His assumptions about our financial situation had shaped his entire approach to family relationships, and his expectations about his own future security and inheritance. The first clear indication of Marcus's character problems had emerged during his divorce proceedings 5 years earlier, when he had attempted to manipulate Walter and me into providing substantial financial support for his legal fees, by claiming that his ex-wife Jennifer was trying to steal assets that should remain in the family for his children's benefit and his own financial security. Marcus's version of the divorce story painted Jennifer as a gold-digging opportunist who was using Arizona's community property laws to claim half of assets that Marcus had, quote, built through his own hard work and family connections. He presented himself as the victim of an unfair legal system that favored women over men and failed to recognize the importance of protecting family wealth from outside threats and manipulation. But Walter and I had known Jennifer Patricia Rodriguez Morrison for over 15 years, and we understood that she was actually a dedicated registered nurse and devoted mother who had supported Marcus's career while raising their 2 children with patience, love, and consistent values that he had never adequately appreciated or reciprocated. The truth about Marcus's divorce was that he had become increasingly selfish and demanding over the course of their marriage, treating Jennifer as a personal assistant rather than a partner, and expecting her to manage all household responsibilities, childcare, and family scheduling, while also working full-time as a nurse to supplement their family income and provide the health insurance benefits that Marcus's insurance adjuster position didn't offer. Marcus had never acknowledged Jennifer's contributions to their family's financial stability and well-being. He had taken credit for their comfortable lifestyle while dismissing her nursing career as just a job that was less important than his work in the insurance industry. When Jennifer would try to discuss family finances, future planning, or major decisions, Marcus would interrupt or dismiss her concerns as evidence that she didn't understand business or, quote, couldn't handle complex thinking. The marriage had deteriorated over 15 years as Marcus became more controlling and dismissive, while Jennifer became increasingly isolated and unsupported. When Jennifer finally reached her breaking point and filed for divorce, Marcus's reaction had been outrage that she would dare to claim half of his assets rather than gratitude for 15 years of support and dedication that had made his comfortable lifestyle possible. Marcus's attempts to gain our financial support for his divorce legal fees had revealed the depth of his entitlement and his willingness to manipulate family relationships for personal advantage. He had presented his situation as a battle between family loyalty and outside threats, when in reality it was a consequence of his own failure to treat his wife with the respect and consideration she deserved as both a partner and a human being. The most disturbing aspect of Marcus's divorce strategy was his attempt to use Walter and me as weapons against Jennifer, by claiming that she was trying to, quote, steal money from his parents and damage the family's financial security. Marcus had suggested that Jennifer's divorce attorney was encouraging her to pursue excessive financial settlements that would hurt the whole family and prevent Walter and me from enjoying our retirement without financial stress. These claims were entirely fabricated, as Jennifer had never asked for or expected financial support from Walter and me, and her divorce settlement requests had been entirely focused on fair division of assets that she and Marcus had accumulated during their marriage. But Marcus's willingness to lie about Jennifer's motives and behavior in order to gain our support revealed exactly the kind of character that had destroyed his marriage and would continue to create problems in all his relationships. Walter and I had declined to provide the financial support Marcus requested, but we had helped him find qualified legal representation and had maintained relationships with Jennifer and our grandchildren that acknowledged the validity of her concerns and her right to fair treatment in the divorce proceedings. We had also made it clear that we would continue to have relationships with Jennifer and the children, regardless of the divorce outcome, because we valued character and kindness over family politics and financial manipulation. Marcus's reaction to our balanced approach had been anger and resentment rather than understanding and appreciation. He had accused us of choosing Jennifer over family, and had suggested that our refusal to support him financially demonstrated that we didn't understand the importance of protecting family assets. And quote and see how Jennifer was manipulating the situation. The phrase, protecting family assets, had been particularly revealing because it demonstrated that Marcus viewed his marriage and divorce primarily as financial transactions, rather than human relationships involving love, commitment, and mutual responsibility. He couldn't understand that our relationship with Jennifer was based on respect for her character and appreciation for her contributions to our family, not on calculations about money or inheritance. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of Marcus's behavior during his divorce was his treatment of his own children, 8-year-old Tyler and 6-year-old Emma, who had become pawns in his efforts to gain leverage over Jennifer and access to what he considered his rightful share of marital assets. Marcus had attempted to use visitation arrangements and child support obligations as weapons in his legal strategy, making threats and demands that prioritized his financial interests over his children's emotional well-being and stability. When Jennifer's attorney had proposed custody arrangements that would provide the children with consistent routines and minimal disruption, Marcus had objected not because the arrangements were harmful to Tyler and Emma, but because they didn't provide him with sufficient leverage to reduce his financial obligations. The most heartbreaking moment had come when Tyler had asked Walter why his daddy was so angry all the time and whether his parents' divorce was because of money. The fact that an 8-year-old child could recognize the financial motivations behind his father's behavior was a devastating indication of how Marcus's priorities had become distorted and destructive. Walter and I had done our best to provide stability and emotional support for Tyler and Emma throughout the divorce proceedings, but we had also understood that Marcus's behavior toward his own children revealed character flaws that would likely create problems in other relationships and circumstances as well. A man who would use his own children as leverage in financial negotiations was someone whose moral compass was fundamentally broken. The post-divorce years had confirmed our concerns about Marcus's character and values. Instead of using his divorce as an opportunity for self-reflection and personal growth, Marcus had become increasingly bitter and resentful, blaming Jennifer, the legal system, and society in general for his financial difficulties, rather than acknowledging his own role in creating the problems that had destroyed his marriage and damaged his relationships with his children. Marcus's financial situation after the divorce was actually quite manageable for someone with his income and minimal lifestyle needs. His child support obligations were reasonable given his salary and Jennifer's nursing income, his living expenses were modest in his new apartment, and his job as an insurance adjuster provided steady income and good benefits that many people would have considered quite adequate for a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. But Marcus had become obsessed with the money he had lost through the divorce settlement, treating his financial obligations to his children as burdens rather than responsibilities, and constantly calculating how much better his life would be if he could eliminate or reduce these payments through legal maneuvering or pressure tactics. More concerning was Marcus's behavior toward Jennifer and his children during post-divorce interactions. He would arrive late for visitation pickups, forget about planned activities with Tyler and Emma, and make cutting remarks about their mother that confused and upset the children. When Walter or I would try to discuss his parenting responsibilities, Marcus would respond with complaints about how expensive everything was and how difficult it was to rebuild his life with such substantial financial obligations. The most revealing aspect of Marcus's post-divorce behavior was his treatment of Jennifer during family events, where both parents needed to be present for the children's benefit. School plays, birthday parties, and holiday gatherings became opportunities for Marcus to demonstrate his resentment through passive-aggressive behavior that made everyone uncomfortable and created stress for Tyler and Emma, who just wanted their parents to get along. Jennifer, who was genuinely committed to maintaining family relationships for her children's benefit, would attend these events with grace and patience despite Marcus's obvious hostility. Her behavior provided a stark contrast to Marcus's selfishness and demonstrated exactly why their marriage had failed and why the divorce settlement had been fair and appropriate. But perhaps the most troubling development in Marcus's character had been his increasing focus on Walter's and my eventual deaths and the inheritance he expected to receive when we were no longer able to manage our own affairs. During family conversations, Marcus would make comments about the burden of caring for aging parents and the, quote, complexity of managing estates and financial arrangements for people who were no longer capable of handling such things. These comments were ostensibly expressions of concern and willingness to help, but the underlying message was clear. Marcus was impatient for Walter and me to die or become incapacitated so that he could gain control of what he assumed were substantial family assets that would solve his financial problems and provide the lifestyle he believed he deserved as the eldest son. The irony was that Marcus's assumptions about our wealth were simultaneously too small and too large. He believed we owned valuable assets that would provide him with significant inheritance, but he had no idea that those assets were worth hundreds of millions of dollars, rather than the few $100,000 he was probably expecting based on our modest lifestyle and Walter's teaching career. More importantly, Marcus had no understanding of the legal and financial structures I had created to manage my real estate empire and ensure that our wealth would be distributed according to our values and priorities, rather than simply inherited by children based on birth order or immediate financial need. The estate planning I had completed over the past decade included detailed provisions for charitable donations to organizations that supported education and housing for low-income families, educational trusts for grandchildren that would support their college expenses and career development, financial support for Jennifer and other family members who had demonstrated genuine character and values, and performance-based distributions that would reward family members who showed authentic commitment to helping others and contributing to their communities. Marcus's behavior over the past 5 years had guaranteed that his inheritance would be minimal, but he had no idea that his treatment of Jennifer, his children, and his parents had been carefully observed and documented as part of the character evaluation that would determine his financial future. Every cruel comment, every manipulative strategy, every example of selfishness and entitlement had been noted and would have consequences that he never anticipated. The morning of Walter's funeral had provided Marcus with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate whether his character had improved or deteriorated since his divorce, and his decision to threaten me at my husband's casket would prove to be the most catastrophic mistake of his entire life. Walter Robert Morrison had died peacefully in his sleep 3 days earlier, after a brief illness that had given us time to say goodbye and make final arrangements for his care and comfort. He had been my partner, my best friend, and my trusted advisor for 51 years of marriage, and his death had left me genuinely grieving for the loss of someone who had supported my dreams and protected my secrets while building a beautiful life together. But as I stood beside Walter's casket that October morning, listening to my eldest son whisper death threats in my ear, while family members and friends offered their condolences just feet away, I was already planning the response that would teach Marcus exactly what happened when someone chose to threaten a woman who had spent 5 decades building the resources and connections necessary to protect herself and punish those who tried to harm the people she loved. Marcus had assumed that Walter's death would make me vulnerable and dependent, easier to manipulate and control. What he didn't understand was that Walter's death had actually freed me from the last constraints on my willingness to use my full power and influence to protect my family's values and ensure that people like Marcus faced appropriate consequences for their cruelty and greed. The stage was set for Marcus to discover that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks like they couldn't possibly hurt you, and the lesson was going to be swift, comprehensive, and unforgettable. To understand how completely Marcus misjudged the woman he threatened at his father's funeral, you need to understand exactly who Eleanor Morrison appeared to be in the eyes of everyone who thought they knew her, because the carefully constructed image of a simple working-class widow was so convincing that it had fooled not just my eldest son, but an entire community that had no idea they were interacting with one of the most powerful real estate moguls in the Southwest. The persona I had cultivated over the past 5 decades wasn't accidental or unconscious. It was a deliberate, meticulously planned strategy that allowed me to build an empire while remaining completely invisible to competitors, family members, and anyone else who might have complicated my business operations or corrupted my children's character development if they had understood the true scope of my wealth and influence. Every detail of my appearance, behavior, and lifestyle had been designed to create the impression of a woman who was hardworking, frugal, and completely unremarkable in terms of financial resources or business acumen. When people encountered Eleanor Morrison in her daily life, they saw a 72-year-old woman who embodied every stereotype about elderly middle-class widows in America. I drove that 15-year-old Toyota Camry with over 200,000 miles on the odometer, its silver paint faded from years of Arizona sun and its interior showing the wear that comes from practical use rather than careful preservation. The car was reliable and economical, exactly what someone on a fixed income would choose for basic transportation needs. I had purchased it used 12 years earlier for $8,000, and I maintained it meticulously because that's what a financially responsible retiree would do to stretch their limited resources. The truth was that I owned a climate-controlled garage facility where I kept a collection of luxury vehicles that included a 2023 Mercedes S-Class, a 2022 BMW X7, and a vintage 1969 Mustang convertible that Walter had restored as a retirement project. But these vehicles were registered under corporate names and kept at a private facility 20 miles outside Phoenix, where they would never be seen by family members, neighbors, or business associates who knew me as the modest widow with the old Toyota. My clothing reinforced this impression of modest circumstances and practical priorities. I shopped primarily at discount retailers like Walmart, Target, and JCPenney, choosing well-made but unremarkable pieces that would last for years without requiring replacement. My wardrobe consisted mainly of simple blouses, comfortable slacks, modest dresses, and practical shoes that prioritized comfort and durability over fashion or style. For family gatherings and social events, I would typically wear simple dresses in navy blue, charcoal gray, or black, paired with small pearl earrings that had supposedly been my mother's, and a modest gold wedding band that I had continued wearing after Walter's death. These choices created an image of someone who valued tradition and frugality over contemporary style or expensive accessories. The reality was that I owned an extensive collection of designer clothing, jewelry, and accessories that filled 2 walk-in closets in a penthouse condominium I maintained in Scottsdale under a corporate name. The penthouse served as my real office and contained the sophisticated wardrobe I wore when conducting high-level business negotiations or attending exclusive industry events where my true identity as Eleanor Morrison, CEO of Desert Crown Properties, was known and respected. But perhaps the most convincing aspect of my carefully constructed persona was my behavior in social and professional situations. I had perfected the art of appearing slightly overwhelmed by modern technology, asking for help with smartphone functions that I could easily manage myself, and expressing confusion about social media platforms and online banking systems that I actually understood better than most people half my age. During family dinners at restaurants, I would study the menu carefully and make comments about prices that suggested someone who needed to budget carefully for small luxuries. I would ask servers about portion sizes and request modifications that indicated familiarity with senior citizen discounts and early bird specials rather than fine dining experiences. I would express appreciation for meals that cost less than what many people spent on coffee drinks, and I would carefully calculate tips that were generous but not suspiciously so. When Marcus and Jennifer, during happier times in their marriage, had invited me to their home for dinner parties, I would arrive carrying casseroles or desserts in simple glass baking dishes, the kind of contribution that suggested someone who enjoyed cooking but couldn't afford to purchase expensive gifts or wine. These homemade contributions were always delicious and appreciated, but they reinforced the impression that I was someone who contributed labor rather than money to social gatherings. My conversational style in these social settings was carefully calibrated to seem interested but not particularly knowledgeable about topics like investments, luxury travel, or high-end consumer goods. When other guests discussed their vacation plans to Europe or their experiences with expensive restaurants, I would listen politely and ask simple questions that indicated I found their lifestyle fascinating but completely outside my own experience. I would make comments about how different their world seemed from my own daily life, expressing gentle amazement at the costs associated with luxury travel, designer clothing, or expensive hobbies. These responses weren't mocking or resentful. They seemed genuinely curious and slightly wistful, as if I was someone who appreciated beautiful things but had long ago accepted that they would never be part of my own life. The most convincing aspect of this performance was that it contained elements of truth that made it psychologically authentic. I genuinely did appreciate frugality and practical living, having learned during my early years in real estate that financial discipline and modest lifestyle choices provided freedom and security that were more valuable than temporary luxuries or status symbols. I had also developed genuine relationships with people from all economic backgrounds through my property management work, and I maintained friendships with teachers, nurses, social workers, and other professionals, whose incomes were modest but whose contributions to society were immeasurable. These relationships weren't calculated or artificial. They reflected my authentic belief that a person's worth was determined by their character and contributions rather than their economic status. But the persona I projected to people like Marcus was carefully edited to emphasize only certain aspects of my personality and experience, while concealing the wealth, influence, and professional accomplishments that would have completely changed how I was perceived and treated. The editing process was most evident in how I discussed my work history and current activities. When people asked about my career, I would mention that I had worked for various small businesses and property management companies throughout my adult life, handling administrative tasks and helping with tenant relations and maintenance coordination. This description was technically accurate but gave no indication of the leadership roles I had held or the scale of the operations I had managed. I would describe my current activities as helping out with several small property management companies, assisting with paperwork and tenant communications that kept me busy and provided opportunities to contribute to businesses that served working families. Again, this description was accurate but completely understated the reality of my ongoing role as CEO of Desert Crown Properties and my continued involvement in major real estate developments throughout the Southwest. When conversations turned to financial topics, I would make casual comments about the importance of careful budgeting and living within one's means, expressing mild concern about rising costs of healthcare and utilities that suggested someone on a fixed income who needed to monitor expenses carefully. I would mention that I was grateful for Medicare and Social Security, giving the impression that these programs were essential for my financial security rather than simply one component of a comprehensive retirement plan that included hundreds of millions in assets. The most sophisticated aspect of my deception involved my living situation and the modest home where I had lived for the past 30 years. The house itself was genuinely modest, a 3-bedroom ranch-style home in a middle-class neighborhood where most residents were teachers, nurses, government employees, and retirees with comfortable but unremarkable incomes. The house was located on Maple Street in a quiet residential area of Phoenix that had been developed in the 1970s for young families starting their careers. The neighborhood had aged gracefully, with mature trees, well-maintained yards, and the kind of stable, long-term residents who took pride in their community without being pretentious or exclusive. My house at 1247 Maple Street was indistinguishable from dozens of others in the neighborhood. A single-story brick ranch with a 2-car garage, a small front yard with desert landscaping, and a backyard that was large enough for family barbecues, but not elaborate enough to suggest significant wealth. The exterior was painted in neutral colors that required minimal maintenance, and the landscaping was attractive but simple, featuring native plants that could survive Arizona's climate without expensive irrigation systems. The interior was furnished with a mixture of antique pieces that had been family heirlooms and contemporary furniture that was comfortable and attractive without being luxurious or designer branded. Visitors to my home would see exactly what they expected to see based on my personal presentation, a comfortable, unpretentious living space that reflected someone who valued quality and durability but didn't have unlimited resources for decoration or luxury purchases. The living room featured a traditional sofa in neutral fabric, a matching armchair, and a wooden coffee table that had been Walter's grandfather's. Family photographs covered the mantelpiece and side tables, showing 5 decades of birthdays, graduations, and family vacations that looked exactly like what any middle-class family would have accumulated over the years. The kitchen was functional and well-organized, with appliances that were good quality but not top of the line, countertops that were practical rather than luxurious, and cabinets that had been painted rather than replaced when they showed signs of wear. I kept the refrigerator stocked with simple, wholesome foods and maintained a pantry that suggested someone who cooked regularly but economically. The overall impression was of someone who had worked hard throughout her life and was now enjoying a modest but secure retirement, supported by careful saving and practical lifestyle choices. But what visitors couldn't see was that the modest house sat on property that was worth significantly more than it appeared, located in a neighborhood that had appreciated dramatically over the past 3 decades due to its proximity to major employers and transportation infrastructure. The house itself was fully paid for and had been extensively renovated and updated through property management services that handled all repairs and improvements without requiring my direct involvement or creating any visible signs of expensive work. The electrical, plumbing, and HVAC systems were all state-of-the-art, but the improvements had been done carefully to maintain the modest appearance that was essential for my cover story. More importantly, what visitors couldn't see was the sophisticated home office located in the basement, accessible through a door that most people assumed led to storage space or utility equipment. The basement office was where I conducted the ongoing business of Desert Crown Properties and managed the investment portfolio that generated millions of dollars annually for real estate acquisitions and development projects. The basement office was equipped with multiple computer workstations, secure communication equipment, and comprehensive filing systems that contained documentation of 5 decades of real estate transactions and property management operations. The office was soundproofed and climate-controlled to protect sensitive documents and equipment, and it was secured with biometric locks and surveillance systems that would have impressed security professionals at Fortune 500 companies. But from the perspective of casual visitors who might glimpse the basement stairs, my home appeared to be exactly what a retired property management assistant might be expected to live in: comfortable, well-maintained, but entirely unremarkable in terms of luxury or sophistication. The deception extended to my daily routines and activities, which were structured to reinforce the impression of someone whose life was modest, predictable, and centered around simple pleasures and community involvement. I maintained regular schedules that included grocery shopping at middle-market stores like Safeway and Kroger, exercising at the local community center, and attending services at Desert Hope Methodist Church, where I had been a member for over 20 years. These activities weren't just performance. They reflected genuine aspects of my personality and values. I enjoyed the sense of community that came from shopping at the same grocery stores for years and knowing the employees by name. I appreciated the democratic atmosphere of the community center, where people of all ages and backgrounds worked out together without the exclusivity and pretension that characterized expensive private fitness clubs. Desert Hope Methodist Church provided spiritual grounding and community connection that were important to me personally, but my involvement there was also strategically valuable because it reinforced the impression of someone whose priorities were spiritual and community-oriented, rather than focused on wealth accumulation or social status advancement. At church, I would participate in potluck dinners, volunteer for community service projects, and contribute to fundraising activities in ways that were generous but not ostentatious. I would bring homemade pies to church events, help with cleanup after services, and participate in Bible study groups where discussions focused on faith, service, and moral responsibility rather than material success or social advancement. My church involvement also provided opportunities to interact with people from diverse economic backgrounds in contexts where wealth and social status were explicitly de-emphasized in favor of shared spiritual values and mutual support. These interactions helped maintain my perspective on what was truly important in life, while also providing authentic relationships that weren't affected by considerations of wealth or social climbing. The success of my carefully constructed persona was evident in how people responded to me in various social settings. Restaurant servers would treat me with polite efficiency but wouldn't expect large tips or special treatment. Retail employees would be helpful, but wouldn't assume I was a significant customer who might make large purchases. Medical office staff would be professional, but wouldn't provide the enhanced service that was typically reserved for patients with premium insurance or obvious wealth. These interactions were actually refreshing because they allowed me to experience how most people were treated in commercial and professional settings, without the deference and special attention that my true economic status would have generated. I learned a great deal about customer service, social dynamics, and human nature, by observing how people behaved when they believed they were dealing with someone who had no particular influence or importance. But perhaps the most valuable aspect of my modest persona was how it affected family relationships, allowing me to observe my children and their spouses without the complications that would have arisen if they had understood my true financial situation and business influence. Walter had been my partner in this deception from the very beginning, understanding that our decision to maintain modest appearances was essential for our children's character development and our own ability to build wealth without interference from family drama or social complications. Walter genuinely enjoyed our simple lifestyle and never felt deprived or resentful about maintaining appearances that concealed our true circumstances. Our younger children, Michael and Sarah, had both benefited enormously from growing up in a household where hard work, education, and genuine concern for others were valued more than material possessions or social status. Both had developed strong work ethics, healthy relationships, and realistic understanding of money and responsibility that had served them well in their adult lives. Michael Morrison had become a successful civil engineer who specialized in sustainable infrastructure projects, working for a consulting firm that designed water treatment facilities and renewable energy systems for municipalities throughout the Southwest. His career was personally fulfilling and financially rewarding, and he had built his success through his own efforts and expertise, rather than family connections or inherited advantages. Michael's wife, Patricia, was a high school counselor who worked with at-risk students and had genuine passion for helping young people overcome challenges and achieve their educational goals. Their marriage was strong, and their two children, 12-year-old Daniel and 9-year-old Sophie, were developing the same values of hard work and service that had characterized our family for generations. Michael and Patricia's treatment of me was consistently loving, respectful, and considerate, in ways that suggested their values were aligned with genuine family loyalty rather than financial opportunism. They would call regularly to check on my welfare, invite me to dinner parties and family celebrations, and include me in holiday plans without any indication that they viewed me as a burden or social liability. When I needed assistance with household repairs, transportation, or technology issues, Michael and Patricia would respond promptly and graciously, treating these requests as normal family obligations rather than inconveniences. Their behavior toward me provided reassurance that my decision to conceal my wealth had been wise, because it allowed our relationship to develop based on authentic family bonds rather than financial considerations. Sarah Morrison Chin had become a pediatric nurse practitioner who worked at Phoenix Children's Hospital, providing specialized care for children with chronic illnesses and developmental disabilities. Her career was demanding and emotionally challenging, but she had found genuine purpose in helping families navigate complex medical situations and ensuring that children received the best possible care regardless of their family's economic circumstances. Sarah's husband, David Chen, was a software engineer who developed educational applications for children with learning disabilities. Their combined careers reflected shared values of service and innovation that made Walter and me proud of the people they had become and the contributions they were making to their community. Sarah and David's two children, 10-year-old Emma and 7-year-old James, were thriving academically and socially, developing the kind of character and values that suggested they would continue our family's tradition of hard work, education, and genuine concern for others. Sarah's treatment of me was equally loving and respectful, characterized by regular phone calls, thoughtful gifts, and inclusion in family activities that demonstrated authentic affection rather than calculated behavior designed to maintain good relationships for inheritance purposes. When Sarah's family visited my modest home, they would express genuine appreciation for my cooking, ask about my daily activities with real interest, and treat me as a valued family member whose opinions and preferences mattered. The contrast between Michael and Sarah's authentic family loyalty and Marcus's increasingly calculating behavior had become more pronounced over the past decade, particularly after Marcus's divorce, when his financial pressures had intensified his focus on inheritance and family wealth. Where Michael and Sarah would ask about my health, my social activities, and my emotional well-being after Walter's death, Marcus would ask about my financial situation and my plans for managing everything, in ways that revealed his primary concern was gaining access to what he assumed were valuable family assets. Where Michael and Sarah would offer to help with household maintenance, grocery shopping, or transportation needs, Marcus would suggest that I should consider moving to a smaller place or think about simplifying my finances in ways that were obviously motivated by his desire to accelerate his access to inheritance rather than genuine concern for my welfare. The difference in their approaches to family relationships had confirmed that my strategy of concealing my wealth had worked exactly as intended. Michael and Sarah had developed genuine character and authentic values because they had never been corrupted by knowledge of significant family wealth, while Marcus had revealed character flaws that would have been much worse if he had understood the true scope of what he stood to inherit. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of my deception was how I had managed to build and operate a multi-hundred-million-dollar real estate empire while maintaining the appearance of someone whose involvement in property management was limited to part-time administrative work for small local companies. Desert Crown Properties operated through a complex network of subsidiary companies, partnership arrangements, and management contracts that allowed me to control thousands of properties throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area, while maintaining complete anonymity as the ultimate owner and decision-maker. The company's public face was managed by a team of professional executives, attorneys, and property managers who handled all visible operations while I maintained strategic control through carefully structured legal arrangements that protected my privacy and ensured that my involvement remained completely invisible to tenants, contractors, city officials, and anyone else who might have connected my modest personal circumstances with my business empire. My daily involvement in Desert Crown Properties was conducted entirely through secure communication systems, private meetings at undisclosed locations, and careful coordination with trusted advisors who had worked with me for decades and understood the importance of maintaining my cover story. The financial systems that supported my empire were equally sophisticated, involving multiple bank accounts, investment funds, and corporate structures that ensured my personal wealth remained completely separate from my apparent modest circumstances. Property revenues, investment income, and business profits were all managed through corporate accounts that had no visible connection to Eleanor Morrison of 1247 Maple Street. When I needed to access significant funds for major real estate acquisitions or business investments, the transactions were handled entirely through corporate entities that could make million-dollar purchases and development commitments without creating any paper trail that might reveal my personal involvement or compromise my modest lifestyle. The legal and accounting professionals who managed these complex arrangements were among the most respected in their fields, and they had developed sophisticated systems for ensuring that my business activities remained completely invisible while complying with all regulatory requirements and tax obligations. But the most impressive aspect of my hidden empire was how I had managed to become one of the most successful real estate investors in Arizona while maintaining personal relationships and community involvement that were entirely consistent with my modest public persona. This balancing act had required extraordinary discipline and planning, but it had allowed me to build wealth and influence while protecting my family from the complications and corruptions that often accompany visible wealth. I could evaluate business opportunities based on their merits rather than social considerations, and I could make investment decisions based on long-term strategy rather than short-term image management. Most importantly, I could observe the character and behavior of people like Marcus, without the distorting effects of obvious wealth that might have encouraged calculated performance rather than authentic behavior. The woman Marcus thought he could threaten and intimidate was actually someone who controlled more real estate in Phoenix than most people could imagine, someone whose business decisions affected thousands of families and dozens of communities throughout the Southwest, someone whose financial resources and industry connections could destroy or enhance careers, reputations, and entire business operations with a few strategic phone calls. But Marcus had never bothered to look beyond the modest exterior that concealed one of the most successful business careers in Arizona history, and his failure to understand who he was really threatening would prove to be the most catastrophic mistake of his entire life. The stage was set for Marcus to discover that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks like they couldn't possibly hurt you, and the lesson was going to be comprehensive, devastating, and permanent. To understand why Marcus's threat at his father's funeral would result in such devastating consequences, you need to understand exactly who Marcus Anthony Morrison had become by the time he made his catastrophic mistake. Not the loving son he pretended to be during family gatherings, but a calculating, narcissistic predator whose obsession with money and entitlement had transformed him into someone capable of extraordinary cruelty when he believed no one could stop him. Marcus Anthony Morrison was born in February 1975 in Phoenix, Arizona, the first child of Walter and Eleanor Morrison. From his earliest memories, Marcus's life had been defined by comfort, security, and the kind of stable, middle-class existence that most children could only dream of having. But instead of developing gratitude for his privileged circumstances, Marcus had somehow transformed these advantages into a foundation for resentment, entitlement, and an insatiable hunger for wealth and status that would eventually consume every healthy relationship in his life. While other children learned to appreciate what they had and understand the value of hard work through their family experiences, Marcus's worldview had been shaped by a fundamental misunderstanding of how wealth and success actually worked. He had observed his parents' modest lifestyle and concluded that they were people of limited means and ambition, never imagining that their careful living was actually a strategic choice made by someone who controlled more wealth than most people could comprehend. This misperception had created a psychological foundation that would define Marcus's entire approach to relationships, career choices, and personal values. Instead of developing respect for his parents' wisdom and character, Marcus had developed contempt for what he viewed as their lack of ambition and their failure to provide him with the lifestyle he believed he deserved as their eldest son. By middle school, Marcus had begun to construct elaborate fantasies about the life he would eventually create for himself, complete with luxury homes, expensive cars, designer clothing, and social connections that would elevate him far above the circumstances of his birth. But rather than developing realistic plans for achieving these goals through education, career development, or personal accomplishment, Marcus had focused his energy on identifying shortcuts that could provide immediate access to wealth and status without the effort and sacrifice that genuine success required. The shortcut strategy that would define Marcus's entire adult life was his discovery that his natural intelligence and social skills could be used to manipulate other people into providing opportunities, resources, and support that he hadn't earned through his own efforts. During high school, Marcus learned that teachers would give him higher grades if he was charming enough, parents would provide more privileges if he was manipulative enough, and friends would share their resources if he was persuasive enough about his needs and circumstances. Marcus became expertly skilled at presenting himself as someone who deserved special treatment, whether because of his supposed potential, his claimed hardships, or his projected future success that would somehow benefit everyone who supported him during his current difficulties. He would study people's weaknesses and insecurities, then craft personas that could exploit those vulnerabilities for his personal advantage. But perhaps the most dangerous skill Marcus developed during this period was his ability to identify and target people who were generous, trusting, and genuinely caring, people whose natural impulse to help others made them vulnerable to manipulation by someone who understood how to exploit kindness for selfish purposes. Marcus's approach to relationships during high school and college was fundamentally predatory, based on careful calculation of what each person could provide for his advancement, rather than genuine affection, compatibility, or shared values. He would maintain friendships with people who could introduce him to useful connections, date young women who could provide access to better social opportunities, and participate in activities that would enhance his reputation while requiring minimal effort or genuine commitment. This strategic approach to human relationships continued through Marcus's college years at Arizona State University, where he majored in business administration with a minor in communications, academic choices that reflected his focus on developing skills that would be useful for manipulating social and professional dynamics, rather than building expertise in any particular field that might require sustained effort or genuine talent. Marcus's college experience was primarily devoted to perfecting his ability to appear ambitious and capable, while actually avoiding any challenges that might require real work or expose his fundamental lack of character and substance. He learned to project confidence and competence while delegating actual work to other people, to take credit for group projects and team efforts while contributing minimal effort himself, and to present himself as a natural leader while actually being someone who manipulated others into doing the difficult work that leadership required. During his senior year, Marcus had begun to focus specifically on identifying career opportunities that would provide maximum financial reward for minimal effort and risk. He understood that his window of opportunity was limited. His youth and superficial charm were assets that would diminish over time, and he needed to convert them into permanent security before people began to recognize the emptiness behind his carefully constructed facade. Marcus's strategy for building a successful career was sophisticated and methodical, but it was based on exploitation rather than contribution. He would research companies and organizations, analyzing their structures and personnel to determine which relationships were worth pursuing and which positions might provide access to valuable resources or advancement opportunities. He would present different versions of himself depending on what seemed most likely to appeal to each potential employer or business contact. The approach required Marcus to become expertly skilled at deception and manipulation, but he justified these techniques as necessary tools for achieving the success and financial security that he believed he deserved. In Marcus's worldview, using his intelligence and social skills to manipulate his way into advantageous positions was simply a more efficient career strategy than the decades of hard work and genuine contribution that would be required to achieve similar results through authentic professional accomplishment. When Marcus graduated from ASU in 1997 with his business degree, he was hired as a trainee at Southwest Insurance Solutions, a mid-sized insurance company that specialized in commercial property and liability coverage for businesses throughout Arizona and New Mexico. The position offered decent starting salary, good benefits, and opportunities for advancement based on performance and professional development. For someone genuinely interested in building a career in the insurance industry, the trainee position would have been an excellent foundation for learning the business, developing expertise, and building relationships that could support long-term professional growth. But Marcus's approach to his new job was entirely focused on identifying shortcuts to advancement rather than developing the knowledge and skills that would make him genuinely valuable to the company. Marcus's early years at Southwest Insurance were marked by a pattern of behavior that would characterize his entire professional career: impressive initial performance that was based on charm and manipulation rather than genuine competence, followed by gradual exposure of his limitations and character flaws, as supervisors and colleagues began to understand his true priorities and capabilities. During his first year as a trainee, Marcus had successfully impressed his supervisors with his apparent eagerness to learn, his willingness to take on additional responsibilities, and his ability to build rapport with clients and colleagues. But this impressive performance was actually the result of carefully calculated strategies rather than authentic professional commitment. Marcus would volunteer for high-visibility projects that would showcase his apparent capabilities without requiring sustained effort or deep expertise. He would cultivate relationships with supervisors and senior colleagues through flattery and strategic social interactions rather than professional competence. Most importantly, he would find ways to take credit for successful outcomes while avoiding responsibility for problems or failures that might damage his reputation. The strategy worked perfectly during Marcus's early years with the company, earning him rapid promotions and salary increases that reinforced his belief that manipulation and charm were more valuable than actual knowledge or genuine effort. By 2001, Marcus had been promoted to Senior Claims Adjuster, a position that provided him with significant autonomy and access to substantial financial resources through his authority to approve insurance settlements and coordinate major claim investigations. But Marcus's promotion to a position of genuine responsibility also created the first serious exposure of his character flaws and professional limitations. As a senior claims adjuster, Marcus was expected to make complex decisions about claim validity, settlement amounts, and investigation procedures that required both technical expertise and ethical judgment that he had never bothered to develop. The most revealing aspect of Marcus's performance in his new role was his approach to claim settlements, which demonstrated his fundamental lack of integrity and his willingness to exploit vulnerable people for personal advantage. Marcus discovered that his settlement decisions could be influenced by considerations other than claim validity and company policy, and he began to develop a system for using his authority to benefit himself rather than serving the company's interests or treating claimants fairly. Marcus would approve generous settlements for claimants who could provide personal benefits, business referrals, social connections, or opportunities for side income that weren't reported to his employer. He would delay or reduce settlements for claimants who couldn't offer such benefits, using bureaucratic procedures and technical requirements to pressure people into accepting smaller payments than they deserved. Most disturbing was Marcus's treatment of elderly claimants and people with limited education or English proficiency, who became his preferred targets because they were less likely to understand their rights or challenge his decisions. Marcus would use complex language and intimidating procedures to confuse these vulnerable claimants, then present settlement offers that were significantly below fair value, while suggesting that accepting his offer was their only option. The pattern of exploitation that Marcus developed during his years as a claims adjuster revealed the fundamental corruption of his character and his complete lack of empathy for people who were struggling with genuine hardships. Insurance claimants were typically dealing with property damage, business losses, or personal injuries that had created significant stress and financial pressure, but Marcus viewed their vulnerabilities as opportunities for his own advancement, rather than situations that deserved compassion and fair treatment. Marcus's unethical behavior might have continued indefinitely if he hadn't made the mistake of targeting David and Maria Rodriguez, an elderly couple whose small restaurant had been damaged by a kitchen fire that should have been covered by their commercial property insurance policy. The Rodriguez family had operated their restaurant for over 30 years, serving authentic Mexican food to a loyal customer base in a working-class neighborhood where their business was both an economic anchor and a cultural institution. The fire damage to their restaurant was clearly covered by their insurance policy, and a fair settlement would have provided sufficient funds to repair the damage and reopen their business within a few months. But Marcus saw an opportunity to exploit the Rodriguez family's limited English proficiency and their unfamiliarity with insurance procedures to pressure them into accepting a settlement that was less than half what they deserved. Marcus's strategy involved delaying the investigation process, requesting excessive documentation that was difficult for the family to obtain, and presenting complex settlement calculations that were designed to confuse rather than inform. When David Rodriguez requested clarification about the settlement amount, Marcus would use technical language and intimidating procedures that made the elderly man feel stupid and helpless. What Marcus didn't know was that Maria Rodriguez was the sister of Eleanor Morrison, Marcus's own ex-wife Jennifer's mother, and that Maria had mentioned her insurance problems during a family gathering where Jennifer learned about the situation and immediately understood what was happening. Jennifer's decision to investigate her former husband's treatment of her relatives revealed the full scope of Marcus's unethical behavior and exposed patterns of corruption that had been developing for years. Jennifer's nursing background had taught her to recognize exploitation and abuse, and her investigation of Marcus's claim settlements revealed systematic patterns of discrimination and fraud that violated both company policy and state insurance regulations. The evidence that Jennifer compiled and reported to Southwest Insurance Solutions resulted in Marcus's immediate termination and the launch of a comprehensive investigation that revealed dozens of cases where Marcus had used his authority to exploit vulnerable claimants for personal benefit. The company was forced to pay substantial settlements to claimants who had been cheated by Marcus's fraudulent practices, and Marcus faced potential criminal charges for insurance fraud and abuse of authority. But perhaps the most devastating consequence of the insurance scandal was the impact on Marcus's marriage to Jennifer, who had previously tolerated his selfishness and manipulation, but could not accept his willingness to exploit elderly and vulnerable people for personal profit. Jennifer's discovery of Marcus's professional corruption had forced her to confront the reality of who her husband actually was beneath his superficial charm and apparent respectability. The insurance scandal had occurred during the same period when Marcus and Jennifer's marriage was deteriorating due to his increasing demands for financial support and lifestyle upgrades that were beyond their means. Jennifer had been working full-time as a registered nurse, while also managing all household responsibilities and childcare for their 2 young children, but Marcus had been pressuring her to take on additional nursing shifts to generate more income for his personal spending and investment schemes. Marcus's response to losing his job was not shame or determination to rebuild his career through honest effort, but anger and resentment toward Jennifer for interfering with his business practices and sabotaging his professional opportunities. He blamed Jennifer for his termination, rather than accepting responsibility for the unethical behavior that had made his termination inevitable. The job loss had also created financial pressure that revealed the extent of Marcus's irresponsible spending and his complete lack of financial planning or emergency savings. Despite earning a comfortable salary for over 5 years, Marcus had accumulated almost no savings and had actually created substantial debt through credit card spending on luxury items and get-rich-quick investment schemes that had promised easy profits but delivered only losses. Marcus's financial irresponsibility had been hidden from Jennifer through a combination of separate bank accounts, credit cards in his name only, and complex explanations about, quote, business investments that Jennifer had trusted but never fully understood. When Marcus lost his job and could no longer maintain these deceptions, Jennifer discovered that their family's financial situation was far more precarious than she had realized. The combination of Marcus's job loss, financial deception, and professional corruption had created a crisis that revealed fundamental problems with his character that Jennifer could no longer ignore or rationalize. She began to understand that her husband's selfishness and manipulation weren't temporary character flaws that could be corrected through love and patience, but permanent aspects of his personality that would continue to create problems for their family and anyone else who trusted him. Marcus's response to Jennifer's growing awareness of his character flaws was not introspection or efforts to change his behavior, but increasingly aggressive attempts to control and manipulate her through emotional abuse, financial pressure, and threats that revealed the depth of his narcissism and entitlement. When Jennifer suggested that Marcus should seek professional help to address his ethical problems and develop healthier approaches to money and relationships, Marcus's reaction was rage rather than consideration. He accused Jennifer of being unsupportive and disloyal for questioning his judgment, and suggested that her criticism was evidence of her own limitations rather than legitimate concerns about his behavior. Marcus's approach to finding new employment after his termination revealed the same pattern of entitlement and deception that had characterized his insurance career. Rather than acknowledging his professional failures and working to rebuild his reputation through honest effort, Marcus focused on crafting explanations for his termination that portrayed him as the victim of unfair treatment rather than the perpetrator of unethical behavior. Marcus would tell potential employers that he had been terminated due to, quote, personality conflicts with supervisors who were threatened by his success and innovation. He would present his insurance fraud as aggressive advocacy for claimants and suggest that his termination was the result of company politics rather than legitimate concerns about his professional conduct. These deceptive explanations were initially successful in helping Marcus find new employment, but they also established a pattern of dishonesty that would continue to create problems throughout his career. Marcus never learned to take responsibility for his mistakes or develop genuine professional competence, so he continued to rely on manipulation and deception to maintain his career, while avoiding the hard work and character development that genuine success required. Over the following years, Marcus worked for several different insurance companies and financial services firms, but his employment history was marked by a consistent pattern of initial success, followed by growing problems as supervisors and colleagues began to recognize his limitations and character flaws. He would typically perform well during his first year with a new company, then begin to exhibit the same unethical behavior and manipulative tactics that had caused problems in his previous positions. By 2015, Marcus had been terminated from 3 different companies for various combinations of unethical behavior, poor performance, and conflicts with supervisors and colleagues. His professional reputation in the Phoenix insurance industry had become so damaged that he was forced to accept positions with smaller, less reputable companies that were willing to hire someone with his problematic employment history. The deterioration of Marcus's professional career was accompanied by parallel deterioration in his personal relationships and family responsibilities. His marriage to Jennifer had become increasingly strained as she struggled to maintain family stability while dealing with Marcus's professional problems, financial irresponsibility, and emotional abuse. Marcus's treatment of his children during this period was particularly disturbing, as he began to view Tyler and Emma as burdens rather than blessings, and as potential sources of financial leverage rather than human beings who deserved love and protection. When Jennifer would ask Marcus to spend more time with the children or take greater responsibility for their care and development, Marcus would respond with complaints about how expensive children were and how difficult it was to, quote, build a career while dealing with family obligations. The most heartbreaking aspect of Marcus's relationship with his children was his complete lack of interest in their emotional well-being or personal development. He would miss school events, forget important occasions like birthdays and holidays, and show obvious impatience when Tyler and Emma wanted his attention or affection. When the children would ask Jennifer why their father was always angry or never wanted to play, Jennifer would struggle to provide explanations that protected their feelings while acknowledging the reality of their father's emotional limitations. Marcus's behavior toward Jennifer during the final years of their marriage revealed the full extent of his narcissism and his willingness to use emotional abuse to maintain control over people who threatened his self-image or interfered with his goals. When Jennifer would express concerns about his professional problems or suggest that he should take greater responsibility for family finances and childcare, Marcus would respond with verbal attacks that were designed to undermine her confidence and make her doubt her own perceptions and judgment. Marcus would tell Jennifer that she was too emotional to understand complex professional and financial issues, that her nursing career was just a job that didn't qualify her to offer opinions about serious business matters, and that her concerns about his behavior were evidence of her own psychological problems rather than legitimate observations about his character and actions. These verbal attacks were calculated to isolate Jennifer and make her dependent on Marcus's approval and validation, but they were also symptoms of Marcus's fundamental inability to accept criticism or acknowledge his own limitations and failures. Marcus's narcissism had become so severe that he genuinely believed his own deceptions and viewed any challenge to his self-image as an attack that deserved retaliation. The breaking point in Marcus and Jennifer's marriage came in early 2018, when Jennifer discovered that Marcus had been stealing money from their children's college savings accounts to fund his personal spending and failed investment schemes. The discovery was particularly devastating because Jennifer had been working extra nursing shifts for years to contribute to those savings accounts, believing that she was helping to secure her children's educational future. Marcus's response to being confronted about the theft was not remorse or commitment to repay the money, but anger that Jennifer had violated his privacy by checking financial accounts that he considered his own responsibility to manage. He accused Jennifer of being, quote, paranoid and controlling for monitoring family finances, and he suggested that her discovery of his theft was evidence of her lack of trust rather than legitimate concern about financial security for their children. The college savings theft was the final confirmation Jennifer needed that Marcus's character problems were not temporary issues that could be resolved through marriage counseling or personal growth, but permanent aspects of his personality that would continue to threaten their family's security and well-being. She filed for divorce in March 2018, seeking fair division of marital assets and custody arrangements that would protect Tyler and Emma from the emotional damage that continued exposure to their father's behavior would inevitably cause. Marcus's response to the divorce filing revealed new depths of cruelty and manipulation that shocked even Jennifer, who had been dealing with his selfishness and abuse for years. Rather than accepting responsibility for the failures that had destroyed their marriage, Marcus launched a campaign of harassment and intimidation that was designed to pressure Jennifer into withdrawing her divorce petition and accepting a reconciliation on his terms. Marcus's divorce strategy involved a combination of emotional manipulation, financial pressure, and legal threats that demonstrated his willingness to use their children as weapons in his efforts to avoid the consequences of his behavior. He would promise Tyler and Emma expensive gifts and special privileges if they would express preferences for living with him rather than their mother, and he would make subtle threats about how divorce would make their family poor and force them to give up activities and possessions they enjoyed. Marcus also attempted to use Walter and me as allies in his efforts to pressure Jennifer into reconciliation, presenting his version of the marriage problems that portrayed Jennifer as unreasonable and vindictive, while concealing the theft, abuse, and professional misconduct that had actually caused the relationship's deterioration. But Walter and I had been observing Marcus's character development for decades, and we understood that his marriage problems were the inevitable result of his selfishness and entitlement rather than Jennifer's supposed failings. When Marcus asked us to provide financial support for his legal fees and to pressure Jennifer to reconsider the divorce, we declined and made it clear that we supported whatever decision Jennifer felt was best for herself and the children. Marcus's reaction to our refusal to support his divorce strategy was the first clear indication of the resentment and entitlement that had been building beneath his superficial charm and apparent respect for family relationships. He accused us of choosing outsiders over family and suggested that our support for Jennifer demonstrated that we didn't understand loyalty or appreciate everything he had done for our family over the years. The phrase, "everything he had done," was particularly revealing because Marcus genuinely believed that his mere existence as our eldest son constituted a contribution that deserved rewards and support, regardless of his actual behavior or character. Marcus had developed such severe narcissism that he viewed family relationships as transactions, where his participation was valuable consideration that obligated other people to provide resources and support without regard to his conduct or reciprocal contributions. The divorce proceedings that followed revealed the full extent of Marcus's financial irresponsibility and his willingness to use legal procedures to harass and intimidate Jennifer, rather than seeking fair resolution of their marital dissolution. Marcus's attorney would file frivolous motions, request excessive documentation, and challenge reasonable proposals in ways that were obviously designed to increase Jennifer's legal costs and emotional stress, rather than achieve legitimate legal objectives. Marcus's behavior during custody evaluations and family court proceedings was equally manipulative and destructive. He would present himself as a devoted father who was being unfairly separated from his children by a vindictive ex-wife, while simultaneously demonstrating through his actions that his interest in Tyler and Emma was primarily motivated by his desire to reduce child support obligations and maintain control over Jennifer's life. The most disturbing aspect of Marcus's divorce behavior was his willingness to expose Tyler and Emma to adult conflicts and emotional manipulation that caused genuine psychological harm to children who were already struggling to understand why their family was dissolving. Marcus would make inappropriate comments about financial stress, legal procedures, and his resentment toward their mother in ways that confused and frightened the children, while serving no legitimate purpose other than Marcus's desire to vent his anger and frustration. By the time the divorce was finalized in late 2018, Marcus had succeeded in making the process as expensive, stressful, and emotionally damaging as possible for everyone involved, including his own children. But he had also revealed his true character to family court officials, custody evaluators, and legal professionals, who would remember his behavior and ensure that future interactions involving Tyler and Emma would be carefully monitored to protect the children from further manipulation and emotional abuse. The post-divorce years had provided Marcus with opportunities to rebuild his relationships with his children and demonstrate personal growth that might have repaired some of the damage his behavior had caused to his family relationships. Instead, Marcus had used those years to develop new strategies for manipulation and control that revealed the permanence of his character flaws and his complete inability to learn from his mistakes or accept responsibility for the consequences of his actions. Marcus's treatment of Tyler and Emma during visitation periods had become increasingly negligent and emotionally harmful as he struggled to balance his resentment toward Jennifer with his legal obligations to maintain relationships with his children. He would arrive late for scheduled pickups, cancel planned activities at the last minute, and use the time with his children to gather information about Jennifer's personal life and financial situation, rather than focusing on their needs and well-being. More concerning was Marcus's obvious impatience with normal childhood needs and behaviors that interfered with his personal priorities and social activities. When Tyler and Emma wanted to engage in age-appropriate play, discuss their school activities, or simply spend quiet time with their father, Marcus would respond with barely concealed irritation and would frequently suggest that they were, quote, being too demanding or not appreciating the time and money he was spending on them. The most heartbreaking aspect of Marcus's post-divorce relationship with his children was his complete failure to understand that Tyler and Emma needed stability, consistency, and emotional support to recover from the trauma of their parents' divorce and develop healthy attachments and self-esteem. Instead of providing the patience and nurturing that children require during difficult transitions, Marcus had treated them as inconveniences that interfered with his efforts to rebuild his social life and pursue new romantic relationships. Marcus's romantic relationships after his divorce had followed predictable patterns that revealed his fundamental inability to form genuine emotional connections or maintain healthy partnerships with women who understood his true character. He would typically target women who were vulnerable due to their own relationship problems, financial difficulties, or emotional needs that made them susceptible to manipulation by someone who presented himself as successful and caring. Marcus's approach to post-divorce dating was entirely focused on finding women who could provide financial benefits, social connections, or ego validation without requiring genuine emotional investment or character development on his part. He would present different versions of himself depending on what seemed most likely to appeal to each potential partner, concealing his professional problems, financial difficulties, and history of manipulative behavior, until after relationships were established and women had become emotionally invested. The pattern would typically begin with intense romantic attention and promises of future commitment that were designed to create emotional dependency and override rational evaluation of Marcus's actual character and circumstances. Once women became emotionally attached, Marcus would gradually reveal increasing demands for financial support, domestic services, and accommodation of his needs and preferences, without offering comparable consideration or respect in return. Most of Marcus's post-divorce relationships ended when women began to recognize the similarities between his behavior and patterns they had experienced with other manipulative partners, or when they discovered the deceptions he had used to conceal his true circumstances and character. But some relationships lasted longer and caused more damage, because Marcus had become increasingly skilled at identifying and exploiting women whose backgrounds made them particularly vulnerable to emotional manipulation and financial abuse. By 2020, Marcus's personal and professional life had deteriorated to the point where he was essentially unemployable in any position that required integrity or competence, and his romantic relationships were limited to women who were either unaware of his history or were dealing with personal problems that prevented them from recognizing the warning signs of his manipulative behavior. Marcus's response to these cumulative failures was not self-reflection or efforts to develop genuine character and competence, but increasing resentment toward the people and institutions that he blamed for his problems. Marcus had developed elaborate conspiracy theories about how his ex-wife, former employers, and various family members had sabotaged his opportunities and prevented him from achieving the success and recognition he deserved. The resentment and entitlement that Marcus had been nurturing for years had gradually focused on Walter and me as the ultimate sources of his frustration and the ultimate solutions to his problems. In Marcus's distorted worldview, our continued existence was the primary obstacle standing between him and the financial security and social status that he believed should be his birthright as our eldest son. Marcus had begun to view Walter's aging and eventual death not as a natural process that deserved respect and support, but as a business opportunity that would finally provide him with access to the inheritance that would solve all his financial problems and validate his inflated sense of his own importance and potential. The woman Marcus thought he could threaten and intimidate at his father's funeral was actually someone who had been observing his character development for decades and who understood exactly what kind of person he had become beneath his superficial charm and apparent respectability. Marcus's decision to whisper death threats at Walter's casket wasn't an isolated moment of poor judgment. It was the inevitable culmination of 48 years of character deterioration that had gradually transformed him from a potentially decent human being into someone whose narcissism, entitlement, and fundamental lack of empathy had made him capable of extraordinary cruelty when he believed no one could challenge his behavior. But what Marcus didn't understand was that his threat hadn't been whispered to a vulnerable widow who could be intimidated into submission. It had been delivered to someone who possessed the resources, connections, and strategic intelligence necessary to ensure that his cruelty would have consequences far more severe than anything his limited imagination could anticipate. The stage was set for Marcus to discover that some mistakes are too big to recover from, and that threatening the wrong person at the wrong time can destroy an entire life in ways that are both swift and permanent. To understand how Marcus could become someone capable of threatening his own mother at his father's funeral, You need to understand the escalating campaign of psychological abuse, financial manipulation, and emotional cruelty that he had been conducting against Walter and me for the past decade. Because his death threat wasn't a sudden moment of grief-induced poor judgment, but the culmination of years of calculated attempts to break down our resistance and force us to surrender control of what he believed were substantial family assets. The transformation in Marcus's treatment of his parents had begun subtly, around 2014, when he was approaching his 40th birthday and starting to panic about his own financial future and professional limitations. What had started as occasional comments about estate planning and, quote, family financial security had gradually evolved into a systematic campaign of manipulation and intimidation that revealed exactly how far Marcus was willing to go to gain access to wealth that he had never earned and didn't deserve. But the most disturbing aspect of Marcus's behavior toward Walter and me wasn't just his greed or his sense of entitlement. It was his complete willingness to exploit our genuine love for him and our natural concern for his welfare as weapons in his efforts to manipulate and control us. Marcus understood that parents are uniquely vulnerable to emotional manipulation by their children, and he had developed sophisticated strategies for using our parental instincts against us in ways that were both cruel and calculated. The early stages of Marcus's manipulation campaign had been so subtle that Walter and I initially interpreted his behavior as legitimate concern for our welfare rather than strategic preparation for financial exploitation. Marcus would make comments about how worried he was about our ability to manage complex financial decisions as we aged, how important it was for families to plan ahead for emergencies and health crises, and how much easier everything would be if we established clear procedures for managing our affairs when we were no longer able to handle things ourselves. These comments were always presented as expressions of love and concern, delivered in the caring tone that adult children typically use when discussing legitimate worries about aging parents. But the underlying message was clear. Marcus was positioning himself as the responsible family member who should be granted increasing authority over our financial affairs and personal decisions, regardless of our actual capabilities or preferences. Marcus's strategy during this period involved gradually introducing the idea that Walter and I were becoming, quote, confused about financial matters and overwhelmed by the complexity of managing our household and personal affairs. He would offer to help with tasks that we had been handling perfectly well for decades, then express, quote, concern when we declined his assistance or preferred to maintain our independence. When Walter and I would manage our own banking, pay our bills on time, and maintain our household without any assistance, Marcus would suggest that we were, quote, 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 and our family, by refusing to accept help that would make everyone's life simpler and safer. The phrase burden on family was particularly manipulative because it transformed our natural desire to maintain independence and autonomy into a selfish act that was supposedly harmful to people who loved us. Marcus was trying to make us feel guilty for not surrendering control of our lives to him, while presenting his desire to gain access to our assets as selfless concern for our welfare. As Marcus's financial pressures increased during his divorce proceedings in 2018, his manipulation tactics became more aggressive and more obviously self-serving. He began to make direct requests for financial assistance, always framed as temporary loans or emergency support that would be repaid once his legal situation was resolved and his quote-quote career got back on track. Marcus's requests for money were always accompanied by elaborate explanations about how his divorce was creating quote-quote unfair financial pressure that was preventing him from rebuilding his life and being the kind of father that Tyler and Emma deserved. He would present his financial problems as the result of Jennifer's vindictive behavior and excessive settlement demands, rather than acknowledging his own professional failures and irresponsible spending that had created the crisis. When Walter and I would decline to provide the financial support Marcus requested, his response revealed the anger and entitlement that had been building beneath his superficial charm and apparent respect for our autonomy. Marcus would suggest that our refusal to help him was evidence that we didn't understand the seriousness of his situation, or didn't care about the welfare of our grandchildren who would suffer if he couldn't afford adequate housing and support. The most manipulative aspect of Marcus's financial requests was his attempt to use Tyler and Emma as leverage to pressure us into providing money that would primarily benefit him rather than the children. Marcus would describe expensive activities and purchases that the children supposedly needed or wanted, then suggest that our failure to provide financial support would disappoint Tyler and Emma and damage their relationships with their grandparents. "I hate to ask," Marcus would say during these conversations, "but Tyler needs equipment for his soccer team, and Emma wants to take dance classes like her friends. I'm trying to rebuild my career, but the divorce has created so much financial pressure. I know you want the kids to have opportunities, and I promise this is just temporary until everything gets settled." The requests were always temporary and always for the children, but Walter and I understood that any money we provided would actually be used to support Marcus's lifestyle and legal expenses, rather than genuine needs of our grandchildren. We also understood that Jennifer was providing excellent care for Tyler and Emma, and that their legitimate needs were being met through her nursing income and the child support payments that Marcus was legally obligated to provide. When we would decline Marcus's requests and explain that we were confident Jennifer could provide appropriate care and opportunities for the children, Marcus's response would reveal his true priorities and motivations. He would become angry and defensive, suggesting that we were choosing Jennifer over family and not supporting our own son during a difficult time in his life. The phrase "choosing Jennifer over family" was particularly revealing because it demonstrated that Marcus viewed our support for fair treatment of his ex-wife and children as betrayal rather than evidence of our commitment to justice and family harmony. Marcus couldn't understand that our relationships with family members were based on character and behavior rather than birth order or genetic connection. As Marcus's post-divorce financial situation continued to deteriorate due to his professional problems and irresponsible spending, his requests for money became more frequent and more desperate. He would call Walter and me several times per week, always with new emergencies and urgent needs that supposedly required immediate financial assistance to prevent catastrophic consequences. Marcus would claim that his rent was overdue and he faced eviction, that his car needed expensive repairs without which he couldn't get to work, that he owed money to creditors who were threatening legal action, or that he needed professional clothing and equipment to pursue new job opportunities that would solve all his financial problems if he could just get started. These crisis narratives were always urgent and always temporary, requiring immediate assistance but promising quick resolution once Marcus's circumstances improved. But Walter and I began to notice that the emergencies were suspiciously regular, and that Marcus's financial situation never actually improved, despite the various opportunities and solutions he claimed were just around the corner. We also began to understand that Marcus's crisis calls were timed to create maximum emotional pressure, often coming late at night or early in the morning when we might be more vulnerable to manipulation, or during holidays and family celebrations when refusing to help would seem particularly cruel and heartless. The most disturbing aspect of Marcus's financial manipulation was his willingness to use our concern for his physical safety and well-being as leverage to pressure us into providing money. Marcus would suggest that his financial problems were creating dangerous situations where he might be evicted from his apartment and forced to live in unsafe conditions, or where he might be unable to afford medical care or prescription medications that were essential for his health and survival. "I know you don't want to worry about these things," Marcus would say during these calls, "but I'm really scared about what might happen if I can't get this situation under control. I'm not asking for charity. I just need some temporary help to get back on my feet so I can take care of myself and be there for the kids." These implied threats were carefully calculated to trigger our parental instincts and override our rational understanding of Marcus's manipulative patterns. No parent wants to believe that their child might be in genuine danger, and Marcus understood that we would be willing to provide financial support to prevent serious harm, even if we suspected his crisis narratives were exaggerated or fabricated. But Walter and I had also begun to research Marcus's actual circumstances through discrete inquiries and observations that revealed the gap between his crisis narratives and his actual lifestyle and spending patterns. We learned that Marcus was living in a decent apartment in a safe neighborhood, that he had adequate food and clothing, and that his emergencies were typically the result of poor financial planning and discretionary spending, rather than genuine crises. We also learned that Marcus was continuing to spend money on entertainment, dining out, and consumer purchases that were inconsistent with the financial desperation he claimed to be experiencing. When we would drive by his apartment complex or observe his social media activity, we would see evidence of a lifestyle that was comfortable if modest, not the desperate circumstances he described during his crisis calls. The discovery that Marcus was lying about his financial situation to manipulate us into providing money was a turning point in our understanding of his character and our approach to family relationships. Walter and I began to realize that Marcus's requests for help weren't motivated by genuine need or temporary hardship, but by his fundamental belief that we owed him financial support, regardless of his behavior or circumstances. When we began to decline Marcus's financial requests more consistently and directly, his response revealed the depth of his entitlement and his willingness to use emotional abuse to punish us for failing to comply with his demands. Marcus would accuse us of being, quote, selfish and uncaring, suggest that we had more money than we knew what to do with, while our own son was struggling, and imply that our financial security was somehow unfair or illegitimate. "I don't understand how you can sleep at night," Marcus said during one particularly ugly confrontation, "knowing that your own son is barely getting by while you're sitting on all this money that you're never going to use. What's the point of having financial security if you're not going to help your family when they need it?" Quote, the accusation that we were sitting on money revealed Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of both our actual financial situation and our values regarding money and family relationships. Marcus assumed that any assets we possessed should be available to him on demand, and he couldn't understand that financial resources came with responsibilities and obligations that extended beyond his immediate desires and convenience. Marcus's increasingly aggressive demands for money were accompanied by equally manipulative attempts to gain access to information about our financial assets, estate planning, and legal arrangements. He would ask seemingly innocent questions about our banking relationships, insurance policies, and investment accounts, always framing his curiosity as concern for our welfare rather than strategic intelligence gathering for his own benefit. Marcus would suggest that he needed to understand our financial situation in order to, quote, help us manage complex decisions and protect us from potential scams or exploitation by financial professionals who might take advantage of elderly clients. He would volunteer to accompany us to meetings with attorneys, accountants, or financial advisors, ostensibly to provide support, but actually to gain access to confidential information about our assets and estate planning. When Walter and I would decline Marcus's offers of assistance and maintain our privacy regarding financial matters, his response would be anger and accusations that we were being secretive and suspicious of our own son who only wanted to help and protect us. Marcus would suggest that our desire for financial privacy was evidence of confusion or paranoia rather than legitimate preference for autonomy and independence. "Why are you being so secretive about everything?" Marcus would demand during these conversations. "I'm your son, and I'm trying to help you plan for the future. Don't you trust me? What are you afraid I'm going to do? Steal your money?" The phrase, steal your money, was particularly ironic given Marcus's history of financial fraud and his obvious interest in gaining access to our assets for his own benefit rather than our protection. But Marcus's accusations of paranoia and suspicion were also calculated to make us feel guilty for maintaining reasonable boundaries regarding our financial privacy and personal autonomy. As Walter's health began to decline in 2022, Marcus's manipulation tactics became even more aggressive and emotionally abusive. He began to suggest that Walter's mild forgetfulness and occasional confusion were signs of serious cognitive decline that required family intervention and professional care management. Marcus would exaggerate Walter's symptoms and present them as evidence that we were no longer capable of managing our own affairs without assistance and oversight. Marcus would point to normal age-related changes in Walter's memory and energy levels as proof that we needed to establish power of attorney arrangements, update our estate planning, and transfer control of our finances to responsible family members who could protect us from making dangerous or irresponsible decisions. "Dad's clearly not thinking as clearly as he used to," Marcus would tell me during these conversations, "and you're in denial about how serious this is getting. Someone needs to step up and take responsibility for making sure you're both protected and taken care of. I know this is hard to accept, but you can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's obviously not." Marcus's campaign to convince me that Walter was experiencing serious cognitive decline was particularly cruel because it exploited my genuine concern for my husband's welfare and my natural fear about aging and health problems that all elderly couples face. Marcus was trying to make me doubt my own perceptions and judgment about Walter's condition while positioning himself as the rational family member who could provide objective assessment and appropriate intervention. But I had been married to Walter for over 5 decades, and I understood the difference between normal aging and serious cognitive decline. Walter was experiencing some forgetfulness and occasional confusion that were entirely consistent with his age and the medications he was taking for various health conditions. But he remained mentally competent and fully capable of making informed decisions about his life and affairs. Marcus's attempt to exaggerate Walter's condition and push for premature transfer of legal and financial control was transparently motivated by his own interests, rather than genuine concern for his father's welfare. Marcus was trying to create a medical emergency that would justify legal arrangements that would give him access to our assets and decision-making authority. When Walter and I refused to grant Marcus power of attorney or make other legal changes based on his exaggerated assessments of Walter's condition, Marcus's response was to suggest that we were both in denial about our limitations and that our refusal to accept help was evidence of the very cognitive problems he claimed to be concerned about. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Marcus would say when we declined his suggestions. "You're not thinking clearly about this situation, and you're making decisions based on pride and stubbornness rather than practical considerations. Someone needs to intervene before you do something that hurts yourselves or creates problems for the whole family." The threat of intervention was Marcus's way of suggesting that he might pursue legal action to gain guardianship or conservatorship over our affairs if we continued to resist his attempts to gain control. These threats were calculated to frighten us into voluntary compliance with his demands, rather than risk the expense, stress, and humiliation of a legal proceeding that might result in forced loss of our autonomy. But Walter and I understood that Marcus's threats were largely empty because we were both mentally competent and financially stable, with no evidence of abuse, neglect, or exploitation that would justify court intervention in our personal affairs. We also understood that any legal proceeding would require Marcus to prove his fitness to serve as our guardian or conservator, and his history of professional misconduct and financial irresponsibility would make such proof extremely difficult. The most disturbing escalation in Marcus's behavior occurred during the final months of Walter's life, when his terminal illness created genuine vulnerability that Marcus attempted to exploit for his own advantage, rather than providing the love and support that dying parents deserve from their children. When Walter was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in August 2023, Marcus's response was not grief or determination to provide comfort and companionship during his father's final months, but immediate focus on how Walter's death would affect estate planning and inheritance arrangements. Marcus would ask inappropriate questions about Walter's medical prognosis, treatment options, and life expectancy that seemed motivated by financial planning, rather than concern for his father's comfort and dignity. Marcus would suggest that Walter's illness created, quote, urgency about updating estate documents, reviewing financial arrangements, and making decisions about asset distribution that couldn't be delayed until after his death. He would present these suggestions as practical necessities, rather than acknowledging that they were actually attempts to pressure a dying man into making legal changes that would benefit Marcus at the expense of other family members and charitable organizations. "I know this is a difficult time," Marcus would say during visits to Walter's hospital room, "but we need to think practically about what happens next. Dad needs to make sure all his affairs are in order, so that Mom doesn't have to deal with complicated legal and financial issues while she's grieving. We should probably schedule a meeting with the attorney to review everything and make any necessary updates." These conversations were particularly cruel because they forced Walter to think about estate planning and asset distribution during the final months of his life, when he should have been focusing on spending quality time with family and finding peace with his approaching death. Marcus was treating his father's terminal illness as a business opportunity rather than a family tragedy that deserved compassion and respect. Walter's response to Marcus's inappropriate financial discussions revealed both his wisdom and his understanding of Marcus's true character. Walter would politely but firmly decline to discuss estate planning or financial matters during his medical appointments and family visits. explaining that he had already made appropriate arrangements and preferred to focus on more important things during his remaining time. Marcus, Walter would say, with the patience and dignity that had characterized his entire approach to parenting, I've taken care of all the legal and financial arrangements that need to be handled. Your mother and I have worked with excellent attorneys and accountants for many years, and everything is properly documented and organized. Right now, I want to spend time with my family and focus on the relationships that matter most to me. Walter's gentle but clear rejection of Marcus's financial agenda would typically trigger angry responses that revealed the selfishness and entitlement that motivated Marcus's apparent concern for estate planning. Marcus would suggest that Walter was being irresponsible by refusing to discuss practical matters, that his illness was affecting his judgment about financial decisions, and that his failure to provide detailed information about estate planning was creating unnecessary stress and uncertainty for family members who would have to deal with the mess after his death. The phrase "deal with the mess" was particularly revealing because it demonstrated that Marcus viewed his father's approaching death primarily as an administrative inconvenience, rather than a profound loss that would affect everyone who loved Walter. Marcus couldn't understand that Walter's reluctance to discuss estate planning wasn't confusion or irresponsibility, but wisdom about how to spend his final months focusing on love, forgiveness, and spiritual preparation, rather than material concerns. During Walter's final weeks in hospice care, Marcus's behavior became even more inappropriate and emotionally abusive. He would arrive for visits with documents, calculators, and notebooks, attempting to conduct business discussions with a dying man who was struggling with pain management and the emotional challenges of saying goodbye to people he loved. Marcus would ask Walter to review insurance policies, discuss real estate holdings, and explain financial arrangements that Marcus claimed he needed to understand in order to quote, mom after Walter's death. These requests were presented as expressions of concern and willingness to provide support, but they were actually attempts to gain information about assets and legal arrangements that Marcus hoped to influence or challenge. When Walter would decline to engage in these business discussions and ask Marcus to simply spend time with him as a son rather than a financial advisor, Marcus's response would be impatience and frustration that revealed his complete inability to understand his father's emotional needs during the dying process. Dad, I'm trying to be practical about this situation, Marcus would say with obvious irritation. Someone needs to understand how everything is organized so that Mom doesn't get overwhelmed trying to handle complex financial matters while she's dealing with grief. I'm trying to help, but you're not giving me the information I need to be useful. Quote, the accusation that Walter was being unhelpful by refusing to discuss financial matters on his deathbed was perhaps the most cruel and selfish thing Marcus had ever said to his father. Walter was dying of cancer, struggling with pain and medication side effects, and trying to find peace and closure during his final days. But Marcus was treating him like an uncooperative business partner who was failing to provide adequate documentation and transition planning. Walter's response to Marcus's inappropriate behavior during his final illness demonstrated the grace and wisdom that had characterized his entire approach to life and relationships. Instead of expressing anger or disappointment about Marcus's selfishness, Walter simply asked me to limit Marcus's access to his hospital room and hospice facility to prevent further stress and disruption during his final weeks. Eleanor, Walter said to me during one of our private conversations in his hospice room, I don't want to spend my remaining time arguing with Marcus about money and estate planning. I've loved him his entire life, and I'll continue to love him until I die, but I also understand who he's become and what's motivating his behavior. Please don't let him turn my death into a business transaction. Walter's request that I protect him from Marcus's financial manipulation during his final illness was both heartbreaking and illuminating. It confirmed that Walter understood Marcus's true character and motivations, but it also demonstrated Walter's continued love for his son, despite his deep disappointment about the person Marcus had become. When Walter died peacefully in his sleep on October 9, 2023, Marcus's response was not grief or celebration of his father's life and legacy, but immediate focus on how Walter's death would affect his own financial situation and inheritance prospects. Within hours of Walter's death, Marcus was asking questions about funeral expenses, estate administration, and timeline for asset distribution that revealed his priorities and emotional limitations. The most disturbing aspect of Marcus's behavior immediately after Walter's death was his obvious impatience with the grief process, and his apparent expectation that estate settlement should begin immediately, rather than allowing appropriate time for mourning and emotional adjustment. Marcus would make comments about how important it was to get everything organized quickly, and how complicated things might become if estate administration was delayed by excessive grieving or emotional processing. Marcus's behavior during the 3 days between Walter's death and his funeral revealed the full extent of his narcissism and entitlement. Instead of helping with funeral arrangements, supporting family members who were grieving, or celebrating Walter's life and legacy, Marcus spent his time researching probate procedures, estate valuation methods, and legal strategies for challenging estate distributions that didn't meet his expectations. On the morning of Walter's funeral, Marcus arrived at the chapel with the obvious expectation that he would soon have access to substantial inheritance that would solve all his financial problems and validate his inflated sense of his own importance and entitlement. He was confident that his mother would be vulnerable and dependent after losing her husband, and that he would finally be able to pressure her into surrendering control of family assets that he had been coveting for years. What Marcus didn't understand was that his father's death had actually freed me from the last constraints on my willingness to use my full power and influence to protect our family's values and ensure that people like Marcus faced appropriate consequences for their cruelty and greed. The woman Marcus thought he could threaten and intimidate at Walter's funeral was someone who had spent decades building the resources and relationships necessary to destroy anyone who chose to harm the people she loved. And Marcus's whispered death threat at his father's casket was about to trigger a response that would teach him exactly what happened when someone made the mistake of threatening Eleanor Morrison. The stage was set for Marcus to discover that some people are far more dangerous than they appear, and that threatening a woman who had spent 50 years building an empire was the kind of mistake that could destroy an entire life in ways that were both swift and permanent. The moment Marcus leaned over his father's casket and whispered, "You're next, old woman," into my ear, he had no idea that he had just declared war on someone who controlled a $400 million real estate empire and possessed the resources, connections, and strategic intelligence to destroy his entire life before Walter's funeral flowers had even wilted. But what Marcus was about to discover was that some threats are so catastrophic, so fundamentally stupid, that they trigger responses far beyond anything the person making them could possibly imagine or survive. Standing beside Walter's casket at Riverside Memorial Chapel that gray October morning, listening to my eldest son threaten my life, while family members and friends offered their condolences just feet away, I felt something shift inside me that had been building for years but had been held in check by Walter's gentle influence, and my own hope that Marcus might eventually develop the character and wisdom that genuine maturity required. But Walter was gone now, and with his death came the removal of the last constraint on my willingness to use the full scope of my power and influence to protect our family's values and ensure that people like Marcus faced consequences that matched the magnitude of their cruelty and entitlement. "Thank you for coming," I said quietly to the guests who approached to offer their sympathies, maintaining the dignified composure that had served me well for 7 decades while my mind began calculating exactly how to destroy the son who had just threatened to kill me at his own father's funeral. Because you see, what Marcus didn't understand, what he'd never bothered to learn despite 48 years of opportunities, was that the modest widow he thought he could intimidate was actually Eleanor Morrison, founder and CEO of Desert Crown Properties, the real estate company that owned the apartment complex where he lived, the office building where he worked, and approximately 30% of the commercial real estate in the Phoenix metropolitan area. The first phase of Marcus's destruction began within 6 hours of his threat, as I returned home from Walter's funeral and activated communication systems that connected me to networks of professionals who had been waiting decades for opportunities to demonstrate their loyalty and effectiveness on behalf of someone who had made their own success possible through strategic partnerships and business relationships built on mutual respect and shared prosperity. My first call was to David Chen, the CEO of Mountain West Property Management, the company that managed Marcus's apartment complex along with hundreds of other residential properties throughout Phoenix. David had built his entire career through consulting relationships and business partnerships with Desert Crown Properties, and his company's success was directly attributable to the opportunities and strategic guidance I had provided over the past 15 years. David, I said when he answered his private line within 2 rings. I need you to review the lease agreement and payment history for Marcus Morrison, apartment 247 at Desert Gardens. I need a complete file on his tenancy, including any lease violations, late payments, or neighbor complaints, delivered to my office within 2 hours. David's response was immediate and professional, reflecting both his understanding of my business priorities and his recognition that unusual requests from Eleanor Morrison typically involved situations where rapid, comprehensive action would be both necessary and profitable for everyone involved. Absolutely, Mrs. Morrison, David replied. I'll personally review his file and have a complete report ready within 90 minutes. Is there anything specific you'd like me to prioritize in the analysis? The question revealed David's sophisticated understanding of how property management could be used strategically to address problems that required more subtle approaches than direct legal action. Over the years, David had helped me resolve numerous tenant issues and property management challenges through careful application of lease terms, housing regulations, and standard business practices that were entirely legal but highly effective for encouraging problem tenants to relocate voluntarily. I want a complete assessment of his compliance with all lease terms, community standards, and housing regulations, I said. If there are any violations or questionable activities, I want them documented thoroughly, with dates, witnesses, and photographic evidence where appropriate. This is a priority situation, David. My second call was to Patricia Williams, the senior partner at Williams, Chen & Associates, the law firm that had handled Desert Crown Properties' legal affairs for over 20 years, and had built their practice primarily through referrals and business relationships that I had facilitated throughout the Phoenix legal and business communities. Patricia, I said when she answered her direct line, I need you to research Marcus Anthony Morrison, DOB, February 15, 1975. I want a complete background report, including employment history, credit analysis, legal proceedings, and any public records that might be relevant for business decision-making purposes. I need this completed by tomorrow morning. Patricia's response reflected the same professionalism and efficiency that had made her firm one of the most successful in Phoenix, along with her understanding that requests from Eleanor Morrison typically involved significant business implications that justified immediate attention and comprehensive analysis. Of course, Eleanor, Patricia replied. I'll assign our best investigators to this immediately. Should I coordinate with any other professionals or institutions that might have relevant information? The question demonstrated Patricia's strategic thinking and her understanding that comprehensive background investigations often required coordination between multiple sources of information and professional expertise. Over the years, Patricia's firm had conducted numerous due diligence investigations and risk assessments for Desert Crown Properties that had prevented costly business mistakes and identified profitable opportunities that weren't obvious to less thorough analysis. Yes, I said. Coordinate with our financial analysts for credit and asset evaluation, and check with our industry contacts for employment and professional reputation assessment. I want everything that's available through legal channels. My third call was to Michael Rodriguez, the president of Southwest Insurance Solutions, the company where Marcus had been employed until his termination for insurance fraud 5 years earlier. Michael had built his company's success through strategic partnerships and business relationships with Desert Crown Properties, and Southwest Insurance had handled property insurance and risk management for my real estate holdings throughout Arizona and neighboring states. Michael, I said when he answered his private line, I need you to review your records for Marcus Morrison, former claims adjuster who was terminated in 2018. I want his complete employment file, performance evaluations, and the circumstances of his termination. This is for business risk assessment purposes. Michael's response was immediate and understanding, reflecting both his professional obligations and his recognition that information sharing for legitimate business purposes was both legal and strategically valuable for maintaining important business relationships. Absolutely, Mrs. Morrison, Michael replied. I remember that situation clearly, and I can have his complete file ready for your review within the hour. The termination was well documented due to the serious nature of the violations involved. The phrase, serious nature of the violations, confirmed what I had already suspected about Marcus's professional misconduct and provided the foundation for strategic planning that would ensure his behavior had appropriate consequences throughout the business and professional communities, where reputation and trustworthiness were essential for career advancement and financial security. By midnight on the day of Walter's funeral, I had assembled a comprehensive intelligence file on Marcus Morrison that revealed the full scope of his professional failures, financial irresponsibility, and personal character flaws. The information was both devastating and entirely accurate, compiled through legal channels and professional sources that would stand up to any scrutiny, while providing the foundation for strategic actions that would be both appropriate and effective. The intelligence file revealed that Marcus was 3 months behind on his rent payments and had received 2 formal warnings about lease violations related to noise complaints and unauthorized occupancy by a girlfriend who wasn't included on his lease agreement. His financial situation was precarious, with substantial credit card debt, no savings, and irregular income from temporary employment that barely covered his basic living expenses. More importantly, the file revealed that Marcus's professional reputation in the Phoenix insurance industry was so damaged that he was essentially unemployable by any reputable company, forcing him to accept temporary positions with small firms that weren't aware of his history or were desperate enough to overlook his professional problems in exchange for below-market salary requirements. The information also confirmed that Marcus had been engaging in harassment and manipulation tactics with Jennifer and his children that violated the terms of his divorce agreement and custody arrangements, creating potential legal vulnerabilities that could be used to limit his access to Tyler and Emma, while also exposing him to contempt of court proceedings and additional financial penalties. But perhaps the most valuable information in the intelligence file was the comprehensive analysis of Marcus's psychological profile and behavioral patterns that revealed exactly how he would respond to different types of pressure and what strategies would be most effective for ensuring that he faced appropriate consequences for his cruelty and threats. The psychological assessment indicated that Marcus's narcissism and entitlement made him particularly vulnerable to public humiliation and social rejection, while his financial desperation and professional limitations made him susceptible to economic pressure that could force him into compliance with reasonable demands for behavioral change. Armed with this comprehensive intelligence, I began implementing a systematic response strategy that would demonstrate to Marcus exactly what happened when someone chose to threaten Eleanor Morrison, while also ensuring that his behavior had consequences that extended far beyond immediate punishment to include long-term changes that would protect other potential victims from his manipulation and abuse. The first phase of my response strategy was implemented at 6 a.m. the morning after Walter's funeral, when David Chen arrived at Marcus's apartment complex with an official notice of lease termination based on accumulated violations of lease terms, community standards, and housing regulations that had been thoroughly documented and legally validated. The lease termination notice gave Marcus 30 days to vacate the premises or face formal eviction proceedings that would create permanent legal records affecting his ability to secure housing anywhere in the Phoenix metropolitan area. The notice was entirely legal and appropriate, based on legitimate lease violations that any responsible property management company would be obligated to address. But the timing of the notice, delivered less than 24 hours after Marcus's threat at his father's funeral, sent a clear message about the connection between his behavior and the consequences he was beginning to experience. Marcus was about to learn that threatening Eleanor Morrison had implications that extended far beyond his limited understanding of how power and influence actually operated in the real world. The second phase of my response strategy was implemented simultaneously through coordinated actions by multiple business and professional contacts throughout Phoenix who had been informed about Marcus's character and behavior through discreet communications that preserved privacy, while ensuring that relevant information reached decision-makers who needed to understand the risks associated with employing or doing business with someone of questionable integrity. Within 48 hours of Walter's funeral, Marcus received termination notices from 2 temporary employment agencies that had been providing him with occasional work opportunities. The terminations were attributed to, quote, budget constraints and reorganization priorities, but the timing and coordination made it clear that Marcus's professional prospects in Phoenix had been systematically eliminated through strategic communications that would be impossible to trace or challenge legally. The employment terminations were followed by credit account closures, insurance policy cancellations, and service disruptions that created immediate financial pressure, while demonstrating the comprehensive nature of the consequences that Marcus would face for his threats and manipulative behavior. But perhaps the most devastating component of my response strategy was the carefully coordinated legal action that began on the third day after Walter's funeral, when Patricia Williams filed formal complaints with family court requesting modification of Marcus's custody arrangements based on documented evidence of harassment, manipulation, and behavior that was harmful to Tyler and Emma's emotional well-being and development. The custody modification request was supported by comprehensive documentation of Marcus's financial instability, housing insecurity, and employment problems that demonstrated his inability to provide stable, appropriate care for his children. The legal action also included requests for supervised visitation requirements and additional child support obligations that would ensure Tyler and Emma's welfare, while limiting Marcus's opportunities for continued manipulation and emotional abuse. The most shocking aspect of the legal proceedings was the revelation that Marcus's threatening behavior at his father's funeral had been witnessed by several family members and funeral attendees who were willing to provide sworn testimony about his inappropriate conduct and apparent psychological instability. This testimony established a pattern of concerning behavior that supported the court's decision to implement immediate protective measures for the children. But the component of my response strategy that Marcus found most incomprehensible was the systematic revelation of information about my true identity and resources that demonstrated exactly how catastrophically he had misjudged the woman he had chosen to threaten and intimidate. The revelation began when Marcus arrived at Desert Crown Properties' main office building for what he believed was a job interview with a property management company that had supposedly expressed interest in his resume and experience. Marcus had been contacted by a recruitment firm that claimed to represent an expanding real estate company that needed experienced professionals for senior positions in property management and tenant relations. When Marcus arrived at the impressive office building in downtown Phoenix, he was escorted to a conference room where he expected to meet with hiring managers and department heads who would evaluate his qualifications and discuss potential employment opportunities. Instead, he found himself face-to-face with Eleanor Morrison, the CEO of Desert Crown Properties, sitting at the head of a polished conference table with legal documents, property records, and comprehensive files spread before her. "Hello, Marcus," I said quietly, watching his expression change from confusion to recognition to horror as he began to understand exactly who he was looking at and what his presence in that conference room actually meant. "I think it's time we had a conversation about your future prospects and the consequences of your recent behavior." Marcus's response was immediate and revealing, confirming everything I had observed about his character and psychological limitations over the previous decade. Instead of remorse, apology, or recognition of his mistakes, Marcus's reaction was anger and accusations that everyone had conspired against him, and that he was the victim of unfair treatment by people who didn't understand his circumstances or appreciate his potential. "This is insane," Marcus said, his voice rising with indignation and panic. "You can't just destroy someone's life because you didn't like something they said. I'm your son, and I was grieving. People say things they don't mean when they're emotional." The phrase, "didn't like something they said," was Marcus's attempt to minimize his death threat as a simple disagreement, rather than acknowledging the serious nature of threatening to kill his own mother at his father's funeral. His complete inability to accept responsibility for his behavior, or understand the appropriateness of the consequences he was facing, confirmed that he had learned nothing from the destruction of his professional and personal life. "Marcus," I replied with the calm authority that had characterized 5 decades of successful business leadership, "you whispered, 'You're next, old woman,' in my ear while I was standing beside your father's casket. That wasn't grief. That was a calculated threat delivered by someone who believed his victim was powerless to respond. You were wrong about my power, and you were wrong about the consequences of threatening me." The documentation I presented to Marcus during that conference room meeting included comprehensive records of his lease violations, employment terminations, credit account closures, and legal proceedings that had been initiated based on his own behavior and documented failures, rather than arbitrary persecution or unfair treatment. "Every consequence you're experiencing is the direct result of your own actions and choices," I explained as Marcus reviewed the evidence of his systematic destruction. "The lease violations are real, The employment terminations are based on legitimate professional concerns. The legal proceedings are supported by documented evidence of harassment and manipulation. Nothing that's happening to you is unfair or inappropriate. Quote, but the most devastating revelation came when I presented Marcus with comprehensive documentation of Desert Crown Properties holdings and business operations, including properties and businesses where he had lived, worked, and conducted his daily activities for years, without ever realizing that his mother controlled the economic infrastructure that made his lifestyle possible. Your apartment complex, your former office building, the grocery store where you shop, the gas station where you buy fuel, the restaurant where you take your girlfriends. I own approximately 60% of the commercial and residential properties that have supported your life for the past decade, I said, watching Marcus's face as he began to understand the scope of his miscalculation. You threatened to kill someone who has been subsidizing your existence without your knowledge, someone who could have made your life much easier if you had demonstrated even basic respect and human decency. Instead, you chose cruelty, manipulation, and ultimately violence. Now you're discovering what happens when someone with real power decides that your behavior requires correction. The final component of my response strategy was the presentation of Marcus's choices going forward, options that would determine whether his destruction remained localized to Phoenix or expanded to include every city and state where Desert Crown Properties had business relationships and professional connections. You have two options, I explained as Marcus sat in stunned silence, finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his situation. Option 1. You leave Phoenix immediately and permanently. You relocate to a different state where you will rebuild your life through honest work and genuine effort to become a better person. You will comply with all legal requirements regarding Jennifer and your children, including regular child support payments and respectful behavior during any interactions. Option 2, you remain in Phoenix and continue your patterns of manipulation, harassment, and entitlement. In that case, I will use every resource and connection I have built over 5 decades to ensure that your life becomes increasingly difficult until you either change your behavior or relocate voluntarily. Quote, the choice I presented to Marcus was both fair and strategic, providing him with a genuine opportunity for rehabilitation and personal growth, while also ensuring that continued problematic behavior would have escalating consequences that would eventually force positive change or geographic relocation. Marcus's response to these options revealed the fundamental limitations of his character and intelligence. Instead of accepting responsibility for his behavior and expressing gratitude for the opportunity to start over, Marcus attempted to negotiate and manipulate, suggesting that my response was excessive, and that he deserved consideration for family relationships and past difficulties. I think you're overreacting to one comment made during an emotional time, Marcus said, apparently still unable to understand that threatening to kill someone was not a minor social error that could be excused by circumstances or family relationships. I know I said something inappropriate, but destroying my entire life seems like excessive punishment for a few words. The phrase "a few words" demonstrated that Marcus still didn't understand that his threat wasn't just inappropriate language, but a criminal act that could have resulted in arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment if I had chosen to involve law enforcement rather than handling the situation through private channels. Marcus, I said with the finality that had characterized countless business negotiations over 5 decades, you have 72 hours to decide which option you prefer. If you choose option 1, I will provide limited financial assistance for relocation expenses and help you find employment opportunities in a different state where your professional history won't prevent new opportunities. If you choose option 2, or if you fail to make a decision within the specified time frame, you will continue to experience consequences that escalate until you either change your behavior or find the situation unbearable. The choice is entirely yours, but the deadline is not negotiable. Marcus left that conference room with comprehensive documentation of his situation and clear understanding of his options, but his decision became evident within 24 hours when he began attempting to rally family members and former associates to support his position and pressure me to reconsider the consequences I had implemented. Marcus contacted Michael and Sarah, asking them to intervene on his behalf, and convinced me that his threat had been misunderstood or exaggerated. He called Jennifer, demanding that she explain to your family that he was being treated unfairly. He even contacted several former colleagues and business associates, seeking support for his claim that he was the victim of persecution rather than appropriate consequences for threatening behavior. The response from every person Marcus contacted was consistent and devastating. No one was willing to support his position or challenge the consequences he was experiencing. Michael and Sarah had observed Marcus's character deterioration for years and understood that his threat at Walter's funeral was consistent with patterns of manipulation and cruelty that justified strong corrective action. Jennifer's response was particularly clear and final. "Marcus, you threatened to kill your own mother at your father's funeral. I'm not going to help you avoid consequences for that behavior. You need professional help, and you need to stay away from our children until you can demonstrate that you're not a danger to people who can't protect themselves from you." The unanimous rejection of Marcus's attempts to avoid responsibility for his behavior confirmed what I had already understood about his character and the appropriateness of the consequences he was experiencing. Even people who had previously tolerated his selfishness and manipulation could not accept his escalation to threats of violence against family members. On the morning of the fourth day after Walter's funeral, Marcus appeared at my modest home on Maple Street, apparently believing that approaching me in my residential setting would somehow provide leverage or emotional manipulation opportunities that hadn't been available in the business environment where he had learned about his situation. When I answered the door, Marcus immediately began a prepared speech about family forgiveness, personal difficulties, and requests for another chance that revealed his complete failure to understand either the seriousness of his behavior or the finality of the consequences he had triggered. "Mom," Marcus said, using the familial address that he apparently believed would create emotional obligations or guilt that would override my business judgment, "I know I made a mistake, but we're family. Dad wouldn't want us to be fighting like this. Can't we work something out that doesn't destroy my entire life?" The reference to Walter was particularly inappropriate, given that Marcus had made his threat while standing beside Walter's casket and had spent the previous decade trying to manipulate and exploit his parents for financial gain. Walter's death had actually freed me from the gentle constraints that had prevented more aggressive responses to Marcus's behavior during his father's lifetime. "Marcus," I replied calmly, "your 72 hours ended 6 hours ago. Since you chose to remain in Phoenix and continue your manipulation tactics, rather than accepting responsibility and relocating, you're now experiencing option 2. The consequences will continue to escalate until you either change your behavior or find your situation unbearable. You made your choice when you threatened to kill me at your father's funeral. Every consequence you've experienced since then has been entirely appropriate and completely deserved. The only person who can change your situation is you, and that change requires genuine remorse, behavioral modification, and probably geographic relocation." Marcus's response was a final demonstration of the narcissism and entitlement that had made his destruction both necessary and inevitable. Instead of accepting responsibility or expressing remorse, Marcus accused me of being cruel and vindictive, suggested that I was destroying family relationships, and demanded that I stop this insanity before irreparable damage was done to people he claimed to care about. The accusations revealed Marcus's fundamental inability to understand that his own behavior had created every problem he was experiencing, and that continued denial and manipulation would only result in additional consequences that were entirely within his control to avoid through genuine behavioral change. "I'm calling the police," Marcus announced when I refused to negotiate or compromise regarding the consequences he was experiencing. "This is harassment and extortion, and I'm not going to tolerate it anymore." The threat to involve law enforcement was Marcus's final strategic mistake, demonstrating his complete failure to understand that his original threat against me was the actual criminal behavior in our interaction, while everything I had done was entirely legal business activity and appropriate response to legitimate concerns about his character and behavior. "Marcus," I said, with genuine sadness for the person he could have become if he had chosen differently, "you're welcome to contact law enforcement and explain that you threatened to kill your mother at your father's funeral, and that she responded by terminating your lease and sharing information about your character with business associates. I'm confident they'll find your complaint very interesting." Marcus never made that phone call. because even his limited intelligence was sufficient to understand that involving law enforcement would result in criminal charges against him, rather than protection from the consequences of his threatening behavior. Instead, Marcus finally accepted the reality of his situation and chose geographic relocation, moving to Las Vegas within 2 weeks of our final conversation. The relocation was facilitated by limited financial assistance that I provided through intermediaries, along with employment references that were accurate but neutral, providing him with genuine opportunities for rehabilitation and personal growth in an environment where his reputation hadn't been damaged by decades of poor choices and manipulative behavior. The aftermath of Marcus's relocation provided closure and validation for everyone who had been affected by his behavior over the years. Jennifer and the children were able to establish stable, peaceful lives without the constant stress and manipulation that had characterized their interactions with Marcus. Tyler and Emma began to heal from the emotional damage caused by their father's behavior and developed healthier relationships with family members who demonstrated genuine love and consistent support. Michael and Sarah maintained limited contact with Marcus through occasional phone calls and holiday cards, but they were relieved to be free from his financial manipulation and emotional demands. Their own families flourished without the stress and drama that Marcus had created during family gatherings and celebrations. The broader lesson of Marcus's destruction was recognized and appreciated throughout the business and professional communities where his behavior had been observed and his consequences had become known. The story of a son who threatened his mother at his father's funeral and subsequently lost everything served as a powerful reminder that character matters more than family relationships, and that some behaviors trigger consequences that are both swift and permanent. For me, the resolution of Marcus's threat provided closure to decades of concern about his character development and validation of the patient but firm approach that Walter and I had taken to parenting and family relationships. The destruction of Marcus's Phoenix life was both necessary and appropriate, ensuring that his cruelty had consequences while also protecting other potential victims from his manipulation and abuse. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the entire situation was the demonstration that carefully built resources and relationships could be used effectively to protect family values and community standards against people who believed they could harm others without facing appropriate consequences. Today, nearly a year after Walter's funeral, Marcus remains in Las Vegas, where he works as a customer service representative for a small insurance company and lives in a modest apartment that he shares with a roommate. His contact with family members is limited to birthday cards and occasional phone calls that are monitored to ensure appropriate behavior and respectful communication. Tyler and Emma visit their father twice per year under supervised arrangements that protect them from manipulation, while maintaining the minimal relationship that family court determined was in their best interests. The visits are brief and structured, focusing on age-appropriate activities rather than adult conversations about family finances or legal matters. Marcus's financial situation has stabilized at a level that supports basic needs but provides no resources for luxuries or discretionary spending. His professional prospects remain limited due to his documented history of misconduct, but he has opportunities for advancement if he demonstrates consistent reliability and appropriate behavior over extended periods. The most important outcome of Marcus's relocation is the peace and stability that his absence has created for everyone who had been affected by his manipulation and abuse. Family gatherings are now celebrations of love and shared values, rather than exercises in managing Marcus's emotional demands and financial schemes. Jennifer has remarried a kind, stable man who treats Tyler and Emma as his own children and provides the consistent, loving family environment that they deserve. The children are thriving academically and socially, developing the character and values that will serve them well throughout their lives. Desert Crown Properties continues to grow and prosper, having recently expanded operations into Colorado and Utah, while maintaining the ethical standards and community focus that have characterized the company's development for over 5 decades. The business success provides ongoing resources for charitable activities and community development projects that create positive impact throughout the Southwest. And me? I continue to live exactly the life I deserve, surrounded by people who understand that true worth comes from character and contribution, rather than genetic relationships or inherited advantages. Walter's death was a profound loss that will affect me for the rest of my life, but it also freed me to use my full capabilities to protect our family's values and ensure that people like Marcus understand that their behavior has consequences they never anticipated. The woman Marcus thought he could threaten as just a vulnerable widow had taught him a lesson about power, respect, and justice that he would remember for the rest of his life. And everyone who witnessed his education understood that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks like they couldn't possibly hurt you. Justice isn't always swift, but when it comes for people who threaten innocent family members at funerals, it's usually more complete than they could ever imagine. Marcus discovered that truth in the most comprehensive and permanent way possible, and his story serves as a reminder that character matters more than appearances, and that some mistakes are too big to recover from. The stage had been set for justice, and justice had been delivered by someone who understood that protecting family values and community standards was worth any effort required to ensure that people like Marcus faced consequences that matched the magnitude of their cruelty and entitlement. And every time someone treats family members with respect instead of manipulation, or approaches difficult situations with integrity instead of threats, they're contributing to a world where character matters more than genetics, and where people like Marcus learn that their behavior has consequences they never anticipated. That's a world worth building, and it's a world that starts with understanding that everyone deserves respect and dignity, regardless of their apparent vulnerability or their relationship to people who believe they're entitled to special treatment. The lesson Marcus learned that day was simple but profound. Never underestimate someone based on their appearance, because sometimes the person you think you can threaten as powerless is actually someone who has spent their entire life building the resources and relationships necessary to ensure that cruelty doesn't go unpunished. And in a world where authentic values and genuine respect for others are increasingly rare, that's a lesson that more people need to learn before they make the same catastrophic mistake that destroyed Marcus's life and taught everyone who witnessed it that justice, when it comes, is both swift and complete. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.